Somewhere beneath the North Atlantic, in water so cold and so dark that light itself gives up before reaching the bottom, a steel tube roughly 50 meters long and less than 5 meters wide holds 47 men. The air inside has been breathed and rebreathed so many times it carries the taste of oil and sweat and something else. Something the men don't speak about but all of them recognize. Fear, compressed and recycled, drawn in with every breath. The captain stands at the periscope. He says nothing. He doesn't need to. The crew reads him the way sailors read weather, not by what he says, but by how he holds himself, by the particular quality of his silence. And in this silence, everything hangs. Above them, propeller noise, an escort vessel, hunting. This is the world Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock inhabited for the most consequential years of his life. Not the world of flags and parades and the thundering ideology that consumed Germany in those years, but this world, 47 meters down, waiting, listening, making decisions that would determine who came home and who did not. Tonight, we are going to spend a long time with that world. We are going to go down into it, stay down in it, and try to understand not just what happened in the Battle of the Atlantic, but what it felt like to be a man at its very center, skilled enough to survive when most did not, experienced enough to recognize the moment when survival itself became a matter of mathematics rather than seamanship, and honest enough, in his later years, to wrestle with what all of it meant. If you are watching this for the first time, welcome. Settle in, get comfortable. This is not a story that rewards impatience. If you are returning, you already know what this channel does. We go deep, we go slow, and we do not leave until the story is finished. Hit the subscribe button now if you haven't already, because this is exactly the kind of documentary this channel was built to make, and there are many more where this one comes from. Now, let's begin. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous military campaign of the Second World War. It ran, without pause, from the 3rd of September 1939 to the 8th of May 1945. Nearly 6 years of naval warfare across millions of square kilometers of open ocean. More than 36,000 Allied merchant sailors were killed. Roughly 30,000 German submariners died. 3,000 merchant ships went to the bottom. So did nearly 800 U-boats. Those numbers, presented that way, tend to numb rather than illuminate. They are too large for grief. What they require is a human frame, a single career, a single boat, a single man who moved through this catastrophe from its early optimism to its bitter arithmetic end, and whose story contains, in compressed form, the full arc of what the U-boat war actually was. Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock is that frame. He was not the highest-scoring U-boat commander of the war. He was not the most famous in his own time. He was not a propaganda instrument in the way that some of his contemporaries became. What he was, in the estimation of both German naval command and Allied intelligence analysts who studied his record after the war, was something rarer and in some respects more revealing. He was genuinely good at an extraordinarily dangerous job, and he survived it, and he lived long enough to think about it carefully. His career at sea spans the full emotional range of the U-boat war. He was there in the early years when German submarines were sinking Allied tonnage faster than the Allies could build it, when the mathematics seemed, briefly, to favor Germany, when crews came back to Brest and Lorient and Saint-Nazaire and were treated like returning conquerors. He was there in the middle years when the technology began to shift, when radar-equipped aircraft started appearing where no aircraft should have been able to reach, when escort commanders started understanding things about submarine behavior that German commanders had counted on them never learning. And he was there, no longer at sea but close enough, in the final years, when sending a U-boat on patrol had become something that looked, from a distance, uncomfortably like sending young men to die for the appearance of resistance rather than its reality. He watched all of it. He recorded much of it. And in doing so, he left behind something valuable. Not a simple story of heroism or villainy, but something more complicated and ultimately more honest. The record of a professional operating at the absolute limit of his craft, in service to a cause he had not chosen, during a war that his country had no realistic prospect of winning, making the best decisions available to him within constraints that grew tighter with every passing month. This documentary will follow that record from the beginning. We will start in Bremen, in the early years of the 20th century, in a Germany still processing the trauma and humiliation of the First World War. A country in which the sea had a particular cultural weight, and in which a young man drawn to naval service was being shaped by forces far larger than himself. We will follow him through training, through early commands, through the patrols that built his reputation and the patrols that nearly killed him. We will examine his methods, his relationship with his crews, the specific tactical innovations that separated him from commanders who did not come home. We will look at what happened to U-256, his most significant boat, in the crucible of 1943, when the whole character of the Atlantic War changed within a matter of weeks. And then we will follow him ashore, where the story becomes, in some ways, harder. Because surviving a war is not the same as escaping it. Because the knowledge that you were skilled at something that killed tens of thousands of people on all sides is not knowledge that sits quietly in the mind. Because Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock, in his later years, was a man who had questions about his own life that he could not fully answer, and who had the unusual integrity to acknowledge that he could not answer them. That is the kind of story this is. It is a war story, yes. There will be depth charges and convoy attacks and moments of crisis managed in near total darkness. But underneath all of that, underneath the operational detail and the tactical analysis and the historical record, it is a story about what war does to a man who is very good at fighting it, what it costs, what it leaves behind, what it means to look back across decades at decisions made under impossible pressure and try to assign them their proper weight. The Atlantic is still out there, dark, cold, indifferent to everything that happened in it. Somewhere on its floor lie the wreckage of ships and the remains of men, Allied and German both, who did not come back from the years this documentary covers. Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock did come back. He had to live with that. So did his story. This is the complete history of Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock. We are going all the way through it, every chapter, every patrol, every decision and its consequence. You are in the right place. Let's go down. Bremen sits at the edge of Germany's northern consciousness, a city that has always looked outward. The Weser River moves through it with quiet authority, carrying barges and the smell of salt air down toward the North Sea, and for centuries the city built its identity around that motion, the loading of cargo, the departure of ships, the mathematics of tide and wind. By the early years of the 20th century, Bremen was one of the great commercial harbours of Europe, a place where fortunes were made in transit, where the names of distant ports were as familiar to schoolchildren as the names of neighbouring streets. It was not a city that encouraged stillness. The docks were always active, the shipyards perpetually loud, and the men who worked them carried themselves with the particular confidence of those who understood exactly how the world moved goods from one place to another. Into this world, Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock was born, a city of water and departure already written into the grammar of his earliest years. His family carried the sea in their background, the way some families carry faith or scholarship. The Lehmann-Willenbrock household was not wealthy in any grand sense, but it was respectable, connected to the mercantile and nautical world that gave Bremen its economic pulse. The men in his family understood ships not as romantic abstractions but as working machines, vessels with purposes, schedules, and the constant potential for catastrophe if handled carelessly. This was a practical education in itself, absorbed long before any classroom or training ground entered the picture. Young Heinrich grew up hearing conversations that centered on weather and cargo and navigation, on the quirks of specific waterways and the reputations of particular harbors. The sea was never mythologized in his household. It was simply the medium through which serious men conducted serious business, and it demanded serious preparation. The Germany into which he was growing, however, was not serious in any stable sense. The First World War ended when Heinrich was still a child, and the world that peace produced was nothing like the world that had existed before the guns began. Germany's defeat was not merely military, it was psychological, financial, and structural, a collapse so comprehensive that it left the country struggling to locate its own foundations. The Treaty of Versailles stripped territory, imposed reparations, and restricted the German military to a shroud of its former self. The Imperial Navy, which had challenged British supremacy on the high seas and come agonizingly close to strategic significance, was surrendered, scuttled, or simply dissolved. For a boy from Bremen, a port city, a naval city, a city whose identity was bound up in maritime power, this was not an abstraction. The harbour told the story. The silenced shipyards, the diminished traffic, the absence of certain kinds of vessels, these were the visible consequences of what the grown men around him called the Great Humiliation. The Weimar Republic that followed offered political freedom without political stability, a democracy that arrived before the country had learned how to want one. Elections happened, governments formed and collapsed, parties multiplied across a spectrum that seemed to generate heat without light. For a generation of German boys coming of age in the 1920s, the Republic offered few clear roads toward purpose or identity. The old certainties had been destroyed by the war and its aftermath, and the new institutions had not yet earned the trust needed to replace them. Many young men of Heinrich's generation found themselves drawn toward organizations and movements that offered precisely what the Republic could not: clarity, hierarchy, discipline, a sense of belonging to something coherent. The military, even in its reduced and constrained form, retained a certain gravity. For a young man from a seafaring family in a seafaring city, the navy, even the modest rump of a navy that the Versailles restrictions permitted, represented a path that connected his background, his temperament, and his need for structured meaning. His education followed the conventional pattern for a boy of his background and era: solid, disciplined, oriented toward the practical as much as the academic. Bremen's schools were good schools, shaped by the Hanseatic tradition of equipping young men for commercial and technical life rather than purely philosophical contemplation. Mathematics, navigation principles, geography, history, these subjects carried weight in a city built on trade and transit. Heinrich was not a dreamer in any obvious sense. Those who knew him in these years described a young man of focused attention, one who listened carefully before he spoke and who seemed to evaluate situations before committing to a course of action. These were not glamorous qualities in a boy. They were, however, exactly the qualities that would matter on the bridge of a submarine in the middle of the North Atlantic at 3 o'clock in the morning, with 3 destroyers hunting overhead. The shroud of the lost war fell across everything, but it fell with particular weight on naval matters. Germany's surface fleet, the great dreadnoughts and battle cruisers that had fought the British at Jutland, had been surrendered and scuttled at Scapa Flow in 1919, an act that many German naval men regarded not as defeat but as defiance, a refusal to hand over their ships intact. The U-boat campaign of the First World War occupied a complicated position in German memory. Those submarines had come very close to strangling Britain's supply lines, very close to forcing a different outcome. They had been controversial. Unrestricted submarine warfare had brought the United States into the conflict against Germany, but they had also demonstrated what was possible for a nation that could not match its enemy's surface power. For a young man with maritime instincts and a family background connected to the sea, the submarine represented something specific, a weapon of the determined and the clever, a tool for those willing to operate in the extreme margins where conventional power did not reach. By the time Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock was reaching the age at which serious vocational decisions had to be made, Germany's political atmosphere was charged with tensions that would eventually produce catastrophe. The late years of the Weimar Republic were years of escalating crisis, economic collapse, political violence, and the rising force of parties that promised to end the chaos by replacing it with something more absolute. The navy that existed within this context was small, circumspect, and professionally serious in ways that civilian institutions often were not. The Reichsmarine, as it was then called, operated within the tight constraints of the Versailles Treaty, while quietly planning for a future in which those constraints no longer applied. Officers were trained to high standards precisely because there were so few of them. The service attracted men who were willing to invest in disciplined competence, who understood that quality would have to compensate for quantity until circumstances permitted otherwise. The pull toward naval service was not, for Heinrich, a sudden revelation or a single dramatic decision. It accumulated. The harbour he had grown up watching, the conversations about ships and navigation he had absorbed since childhood, the family tradition of connection to the maritime world, the particular respect that naval service commanded in a city like Bremen, all of these things converged gradually into a direction. The desire to serve at sea was not an escape from his upbringing, but an extension of it, a natural continuation of the world that had shaped him. That the Navy would require him to eventually operate within a political framework he may not have fully understood or endorsed, was a complexity that the young man from Bremen, like so many of his contemporaries, likely deferred, if he considered it at all. What can be said with certainty is that Lehmann-Willenbrock entered the world of formal naval training, carrying a background that was unusually coherent for a potential submarine commander. The maritime environment was not foreign to him, not something he had to learn to see or respect. He already understood in his bones the relationship between water and danger, between mechanical discipline and survival. The men who would train him would find a candidate who did not need to be persuaded that the sea was serious. He had known that since he was old enough to stand on the docks and watch the Weiser carry the ships outward, past the pilot boats, past the channel markers, and on toward the grey horizon of the North Sea. Bremen shaped him in one more way that would prove significant. It was a city that understood commerce, logistics, and the movement of material across distance. A submarine commander needs tactical aggression, surely, but he also needs the ability to think about systems, convoy routes, fuel consumption, patrol zones, the logistics of resupply. He needs to understand how goods and resources flow, where the pressure points of an enemy's supply chain lie, and how to apply force at the most consequential locations. A boy who grew up watching the movement of cargo through a major commercial port, who absorbed as childhood background knowledge the patterns of maritime trade, had already begun an education in exactly this kind of systemic thinking. He simply did not yet know that it would one day be applied not to commerce, but to its destruction. The boy from Bremen became a young man from Bremen, and the young man made his choice. The Navy was calling, and the Navy was changing. Germany was rearming under a new government that had no patience for the restrictions of Versailles, and the quiet professional officers of the Reichsmarine were about to see their modest service transformed into something vast and purposeful, and in ways none of them could yet fully calculate, doomed. Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock would be swept up in that transformation. He would emerge from it as one of the most capable submarine commanders of the entire conflict, respected, decorated, and ultimately powerless to change the outcome that history had already written. But all of that lay ahead. For now, there was only the river and the ships and the grey sky over the North Sea, and a boy watching the water with the particular attention of someone who already knows, without knowing that he knows it, exactly where his life is going to take him. When Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock signed his name to Kriegsmarine papers, Germany itself was in the middle of reinventing what it meant to have a navy. The year was 1933, and the political machinery that had seized control of the country was already whispering of grand ambitions at sea, though it still spoke softly in public, constrained by the humiliations written into the Treaty of Versailles. The German navy that Lehmann-Willenbrock entered was not yet the force it would become. It was a service under reconstruction, carrying the institutional memory of the Imperial Navy's final disgrace and the collective hunger to erase it. For a young man shaped by Bremen's waterfront, by the smell of salt and diesel, and the sight of cargo ships moving through grey morning light, the Navy was not an abstract calling. It was the most natural direction the world could push him. The Kriegsmarine of the early 1930s occupied a strange space between legal obligation and deliberate deception. Germany was permitted a surface navy of limited tonnage under the Versailles settlement, but submarines were forbidden entirely. Yet the ideas had never fully died. Former U-boat officers kept the knowledge alive through technical manuals, through conversations held in back rooms of naval clubs, through clandestine cooperation with foreign shipbuilders and friendly foreign governments who asked few questions. The institutional skeleton of a submarine force existed long before the bones had flesh. When Hitler's government began openly tearing up treaty restrictions, the engineers and officers who had been quietly maintaining that skeleton were ready to build something new almost immediately. Into this charged atmosphere came fresh recruits who would be trained not just for the navy Germany had, but for the navy its leadership intended to create. The formal education that waited for Lehmann-Willenbrock was demanding in ways that went beyond seamanship. Naval officers of the Kriegsmarine were expected to understand navigation, ordnance, signals, engineering, command theory, and the shifting geometry of fleet tactics, all while cultivating the physical endurance that life aboard a warship required. The training academies put recruits through rotations at sea on surface vessels, ensuring that whatever specialization a man might eventually pursue, he understood the fundamentals of open water. For Lehmann-Willenbrock, these early rotations confirmed something he already suspected about himself. He was not merely comfortable at sea. He was comfortable under pressure at sea, which is an entirely different quality, and rarer. The men around him who struggled were often technically capable, but psychologically fragile when the ship moved unexpectedly, when orders conflicted, when the drills stopped being drills and started being representative of something real. By the mid-1930s, Germany's intentions at sea were no longer a secret to anyone paying attention. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935 formalized a partial lifting of restrictions, permitting Germany to build a submarine force up to parity with Britain's in certain categories. It was a concession that many in London would come to regard as one of the costlier diplomatic miscalculations of that decade. The German naval establishment moved quickly. Shipyards that had been preparing quietly for years suddenly operated in the open, laying keels and fitting pressure hulls. The first of the new U-boats were commissioned in the spring of 1935, and the men who would eventually command them were already being identified and channeled into specialized training. Lehmann-Willenbrock's trajectory brought him toward this world at precisely the moment it was materializing. Submarine school asked something fundamentally different of a man than surface training had. The environment was hostile in a way that surface sailors rarely confronted so directly. A surface ship might sink, but it sank into the sea from above. A submarine already existed inside the boundary of what could kill a man, submerged, surrounded by millions of tons of water held back by welded steel and gasket seals. The training made this reality explicit. Recruits learned to manage every system aboard because failure of any system could mean death without warning. They learned pressure equalization, emergency surfacing procedures, how to fight fire in a sealed tube, how to control flooding, how to breathe recycled air for extended hours while remaining operationally functional. They learned what carbon dioxide accumulation did to the human mind before the body registered the danger. These were not abstract lessons delivered in classrooms. They were drills repeated until the movements were reflexive, until the body responded, before the conscious mind had finished processing the problem. It was during this period of concentrated technical formation that Lehmann-Willenbrock encountered the senior officers and instructors who would shape not just his skills, but his philosophy of command. The U-boat arm in these early years was a compact community. The men who had survived the First War's submarine campaign were aging but present, their knowledge hard purchased in Atlantic depths and North Sea minefields. Some of them passed on a doctrine of cold calculation, of treating the submarine as a precision instrument rather than a weapon of passion. Aggression without discipline, in this view, got boats killed without purpose. The officers who made names in the First War had generally been those who conserved their resources, read the enemy's patterns, and struck only when the geometry was in their favor. This was the philosophy being transmitted to a new generation, and Lehmann-Willenbrock absorbed it carefully. Among the instructors who left the deepest impression were men who understood that a submarine crew was not simply a collection of technical operators. It was a closed social system, sealed inside a steel hull for weeks at a time, where the emotional temperature of the command directly regulated the crew's functional capacity. A commander who ruled through fear created the worst possible condition inside a submarine, because fear paralyzed exactly the kind of rapid, independent judgment that emergencies demanded. A commander who cultivated trust and competence without sacrificing authority gave his crew the psychological resources to perform when every system was failing simultaneously. This insight was not universal among the instructors, but the best of them understood it, and found in Lehmann-Willenbrock a student who grasped it without needing extensive persuasion. He had by temperament already arrived at a version of this conclusion on his own. The rapid expansion of the U-boat fleet in the latter half of the 1930s created enormous institutional pressure. Boats were being commissioned faster than fully experienced crews could be assembled to man them. The training pipelines accelerated to compensate, and there were officers within the naval establishment who privately worried that the pace was producing men who were technically adequate but operationally shallow. Lehmann-Willenbrock moved through this system with enough ability that he was not swept into the lower quality cohorts that speed was producing. His early postings placed him as an officer aboard operational U-boats, conducting trials and training exercises in the Baltic, where the shallow, relatively calm waters provided a controlled but serious environment for learning the boat's character before the Atlantic offered its own, less forgiving curriculum. Those Baltic postings revealed something important about how the Type 7 class of submarines, which would become the backbone of the German campaign, actually behaved under the hands of their crews. The boat was not elegant, it was not spacious, it was a machine designed to be effective, not comfortable, with tolerances measured in necessity rather than generosity. The crew spaces were cramped to the point of absurdity, with bunks that rotated between men on alternating watch schedules, with torpedoes stored in the same space where men slept and ate. The engineering spaces smelled of diesel and bilge water and machine oil in a combination that never entirely washed out of a man's clothing. Learning to live inside this environment, while maintaining professional sharpness, was itself a discipline, and the Baltic exercises made clear which men adapted and which men merely endured. Lehmann-Willenbrock adapted. His command philosophy continued to develop through observation of the officers above him during these formative years. He watched how different commanders handled the same situations and catalogued the outcomes. He noticed which approaches to crew briefings generated genuine understanding and which produced mechanical compliance. He paid attention to the way information was shared or withheld aboard a submarine, and he developed early convictions about the relationship between crew awareness and crew performance. A man who understood why he was performing a task under pressure was more reliable than a man performing it by rote. This seemed obvious in theory. It was surprisingly difficult to execute in an institutional culture that still drew on Imperial German naval traditions of rigid hierarchy and limited information sharing below officer level. Lehmann-Willenbrock's willingness to push against that tradition in small but consistent ways would become one of his defining characteristics. By the time the 1930s drew toward their close, and it became clear that the European peace was fragmenting under the weight of German territorial ambitions, the U-boat arm had grown from a paper concept into a functioning force of several dozen operational boats. It was smaller than Karl Dönitz, who commanded the submarine service, believed was necessary for a serious campaign against British shipping. Dönitz had calculated his requirements in the hundreds, and he had them in the dozens. The boats he did have, however, were crewed by men who had spent years drilling in conditions as close to combat as training could produce. Lehmann-Willenbrock was among them, no longer a recruit absorbing everything he could find, but a junior officer with formed convictions, technical competence, and the beginning of a reputation among his peers. The education that Bremen and the Kriegsmarine had given him was complete. What would test it was waiting somewhere west of the British Isles, in water that asked no questions and offered no mercy to the unprepared. Bremen shapes a man in ways he cannot always name. The flat grey light of the north, the smell of river water and engine oil, the knowledge that the sea is never far, these things leave a mark. Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock had come up through the Kriegsmarine's training schools carrying all of that, and by the time the Navy placed a command in his hands, he had earned the right to call himself ready. The boat they gave him was designated U-596. She was a Type Vic, the workhorse of the German submarine fleet, the vessel that would define the entire arc of the Atlantic War. Compact, reliable, and unforgiving of carelessness, she was approximately 67 meters from bow to stern, displacing roughly 770 tons when surfaced. To a civilian eye, she was a tube of welded steel, cramped and brutally functional. To Lehmann-Willenbrock, she was the beginning of everything. The Type Vic was not a glamorous machine, Her interior offered almost no concession to human comfort, and the men who served aboard her lived in conditions that shore-based sailors could scarcely imagine. Bunks were shared in rotation, a system the crews called the hot bunk, where one man climbed out as another climbed in, the sheets still warm. Fresh water was rationed to the point where shaving became a luxury rather than a routine. Food stored in every available corner would slowly spoil over weeks at sea, and the air inside the hull, recycled and compressed, took on a texture that new crewmen found almost physically oppressive. The boat could carry roughly 14 torpedoes, and her diesel engines gave her a surface speed of approximately 17 knots, dropping to well under 10 when submerged. She was built for one purpose, and she made no apologies for it. Lehmann-Willenbrock understood that a man who could not respect that unsentimentality had no business standing in her tower. The crew he inherited and assembled was young, overwhelmingly, startlingly young. Many of the ratings had never been to sea before the war at all. Some of the petty officers had genuine experience on surface vessels, but submarine service was its own discipline entirely, and theoretical training at the schools could only carry a man so far. Lehmann-Willenbrock looked at his crew in those first weeks and saw not the finished article, but raw material. He saw intelligence, and he saw anxiety in roughly equal measure. What he needed to do, what any commander worth the title needed to do, was convert that anxiety into something productive, something that would function under the kind of pressure most of these young men had never yet encountered. He had a limited window of time before U-596 would be ordered on operational patrol. He used every hour of it. His approach to command was not theatrical. He did not pace and lecture or demand demonstrations of physical hardship as proof of toughness. What he practiced was something quieter and ultimately more demanding: systematic competency. Every man aboard U-596 was required to understand not only his own station, but the function of the stations immediately adjacent to him. A torpedoman was expected to understand the basics of the hydrophone equipment. An engineer's mate was expected to know the sequence for emergency ballast procedures. The logic was simple and ruthless. In a crisis, men die in the gaps between job descriptions, and Lehmann-Willenbrock was not prepared to lose his boat to a gap. He ran exercises until the sequences were reflex rather than thought, until the crew could move through emergency procedures in darkness and in noise and under simulated attack without requiring instruction. Cross-training of this kind was not unique to Lehmann-Willenbrock, but the consistency and the seriousness with which he applied it set his boat apart. Other commanders drilled their crews adequately. He drilled his crew exhaustively and then found new things to drill. His chief engineer became a close professional partner in this process. Between them, they developed a shared understanding of exactly how far the boat could be pushed in various emergency scenarios, knowledge that had to be theoretical before it could be practical. Lehmann-Willenbrock spent long hours with his officers working through scenarios that hadn't happened yet. What if the forward torpedo room floods during an attack run? What if we lose communication between the tower and the engine room in a crash dive? The questions were not academic. They were rehearsals for a future the war was already preparing for them. Discipline aboard U-596 was firm but not punitive. Lehmann-Willenbrock understood something that less effective commanders did not always grasp. In a submarine, morale and discipline are not separate concerns. They are the same concern approached from different angles. A crew that fears its commander is a crew that hesitates to report problems, and a crew that hesitates to report problems is a crew that dies when those problems compound. He created an atmosphere where a rating could bring bad news to a senior petty officer without terror. where the chain of communication moved information upward rather than suppressing it. This was not softness, it was engineering, the careful construction of a human system designed to function under maximum stress without catastrophic failure. The men of U-596 felt it, even those who could not have articulated what exactly was different about their boat. His personal manner reinforced this culture. He was observed, by those who sailed with him and by those who evaluated him, as a man who spoke precisely and expected to be answered precisely. He did not tolerate vagueness, not because he was impatient, but because vagueness in a submarine at depth is a form of danger. When a crewman reported a reading, Lehmann-Willenbrock wanted the reading, not an approximation rounded for the sake of comfort. When something was wrong, he wanted to know it was wrong immediately, not after someone had spent 20 minutes deciding whether it was worth mentioning. This standard, applied consistently and without exception, became the shared language of U-596. New men learned it quickly. They had to. There was also, alongside all of this professional structure, a quality that survivors and historians would later reach for different words to describe, something that functioned like steadiness, an observable absence of panic in the man at the center of the boat's command. Lehmann-Willenbrock did not perform calm. He produced it in the way that a well-tuned engine produces heat as a byproduct of efficient function. His crew could read him, and what they read in him during exercises and pre-patrol preparations was a man who had calculated the risks, accepted the reality, and decided to proceed. That quality, that sense of a commander who had already made peace with what the sea might bring, was worth more to crew morale than almost any other single factor. Men follow someone who has looked at the danger clearly and chosen not to look away from it. The weeks of preparation before U-596's first operational patrol were intense in ways that only those who lived them could fully measure. The boat underwent her final fitting checks, her systems were tested and retested, and her torpedoes were loaded and secured. The crew drew extra rations, made what contact with families they could, and went through the particular mental preparation that submarine crews learned to perform, the setting aside of everything that existed above the waterline in favor of the total concentration that the boat demanded. Lehmann-Willenbrock walked his boat from bow to stern in those final days, not in the manner of an anxious man searching for problems, but in the manner of a craftsman checking his tools before a long and demanding job. He knew her. He had made sure his crew knew her. Now it remained to be seen what the Atlantic would make of that preparation. The relationships he built in those pre-patrol weeks were not friendships in the conventional sense. The hierarchy of command does not dissolve in a submarine simply because the quarters are close. But they were something more than mere professional association. They were the bonds of men who had rehearsed difficulty together, who had learned each other's capabilities and limits in controlled conditions before they were forced to discover them under fire. His executive officer carried the captain's standards into the daily management of the crew. His chief engineer held the mechanical knowledge that kept the boat alive at depth. His officers of the watch learned to read the surface through the periscope with the specific patience that Lehmann-Willenbrock required. Together they formed something that functioned as a single organism, imperfect, under-rested, occasionally frightened, but fundamentally coherent. That coherence was his real achievement in these weeks, and it was a more difficult achievement than it sounds. Submarine warfare would eventually break boats and crews that were technically proficient, crews that knew their equipment and followed their procedures, and still could not hold together when the depth charges came close, and the hull creaked, and the lights failed, and the air grew thin. What held crews together in those moments was not superior training in isolation, but the specific texture of trust that a commander either built or failed to build before the first patrol ever began. Lehmann-Willenbrock built it methodically and without ceremony, in the manner of someone who knew exactly what it was for. The Atlantic was waiting, and he had no intention of sending his crew into it unprepared. When U-596 finally slipped her moorings and nosed out toward open water, she carried with her everything Lehmann-Willenbrock had been able to give her in the time available. The boat was as ready as she could be made. The crew was as prepared as men can be for something they have never yet experienced. And at the center of it all stood a commander who had committed entirely to the work, not to glory, not to ideology, not to the abstractions of a war he had not chosen to begin, but to the specific and unglamorous task of bringing his crew home. That commitment would be tested almost immediately. The Atlantic has never been generous with preparation time, and the war had its own schedule. U-596 was about to discover exactly what she was worth. The Atlantic in wartime was not one ocean. It was 1,000 different oceans depending on the season, the latitude, and the side of the periscope you were standing on. For Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock, the first combat patrol aboard U-596 meant crossing a threshold that no amount of training could fully prepare a man for, the moment when doctrine stops and reality begins. He had run the drills, absorbed the manuals, and shaped his crew through the grinding repetition of exercises in calmer waters. None of that had happened under fire. None of it had happened with depth charges sending shockwaves through the hull and men looking to him for a calm expression he had to manufacture from nothing. The first patrol was where the officer he thought he was would either be confirmed or demolished. They departed into grey Atlantic weather, which was in some ways a mercy. Heavy seas meant harder detection, harder targeting, and harder pursuit. But heavy seas also meant exhausted crew, unpredictable trim, and the kind of physical punishment that strips away the last romantic notion a young sailor might carry aboard. The men of U-596 quickly discovered that the romanticized image of the daring submarine warrior bore very little relationship to the soaked, cramped, nauseating reality of a type fickic in a North Atlantic swell. Lehmann-Willenbrock knew this. He had seen it in other men's patrols and heard it in the debriefs at base. His task in those early days was not simply to hunt. It was to hold a crew together while the sea did its best to break them before the enemy even had a chance. The first contact came in the form of radio intelligence and the patient arithmetic of convoy routing. Lehmann-Willenbrock was not a commander who simply ran his boat toward the nearest contact and hoped for the best. Even in this first patrol, he was already applying the analytical habit that would define him, weighing what he knew against what he suspected, and positioning accordingly. When the silhouettes of merchant vessels finally appeared in his periscope, the moment was not triumphant in any simple way. It was loud with pressure, loud with decision, attack geometry, estimated target speed, crew readiness, the position and activity of escorts. All of it collapsed into seconds. He gave his orders in the flat, precise tone his crew would come to know as his register for serious work. The torpedo attack itself unfolded with the brutal simplicity that makes combat simultaneously faster and slower than a man remembers it afterward. At periscope depth, with the targeting solution calculated and the boat trimmed for the shot, the waiting was its own particular violence. When the order came and the torpedoes ran, the crew felt the adjustment in trim with each launch, a physical jolt that confirmed the weapon was away and that there was now no version of events in which U-596 had not announced itself. The sounds of impact carried through the water and into the hull before the lookouts on the targeted vessel had time to process what had happened to them. Merchant sailors in the Atlantic understood, in the abstract, that they were targets. But understanding something in the abstract does not prepare the body for it. What Lehmann-Willenbrock allowed himself to observe through the periscope in those first moments of confirmed success was less triumphant than clinical. He was studying the result, the behavior of the stricken vessel, the response of nearby ships, and crucially, the reaction of the escort. The escort's response was the variable that determined whether U-596 survived the next hour. Escorts in this period were a mixed picture. Some were experienced and aggressive, with commanders who had developed an instinct for where a submarine would go after an attack. Others were still learning, but even an inexperienced escort with depth charges and determination could kill a submarine if it was simply lucky, and Lehmann-Willenbrock never confused the absence of a skilled enemy with the absence of danger. The escorts came. They came with the churning sound of high-revving screws audible on the hydrophones, with the crew of U-596 standing at their stations in the kind of collective stillness that has no civilian parallel. Lehmann-Willenbrock took the boat deep and quiet, ordering speed reduced to minimize noise, ordering the crew to stillness that was not merely a precaution but a doctrine. Sound was survival. Every unnecessary movement, every metallic contact, every whispered word that could be avoided was avoided. The depth charges fell, not precisely, not close enough to cause structural failure, but close enough to remind every man in that hull that the calculation between living and dying in this environment was measured in meters rather than kilometers. The boat shook, instruments rattled. A junior rating crossed himself, and nobody mocked him for it. Lehmann-Willenbrock's response to the attack was what began to separate him from merely competent commanders. He did not react emotionally. He did not drive the boat in predictable evasive patterns. He made deliberate choices based on his reading of the escort's behavior, adjusting depth and heading in ways that consistently placed U-596 one step removed from where the escort calculated it should be. This was not genius. It was disciplined reasoning applied faster than the enemy expected. It was the kind of thinking that cannot be fully taught, only developed through a combination of rigorous preparation and the nerve to apply it when everything around you is noise and pressure. He brought the boat and her crew through it. That, for a first patrol, was everything. The psychological aftermath of surviving a depth charge attack is something that post-war accounts consistently struggle to communicate to those who were not there. The physical symptoms were often straightforward: shaken nerves, elevated heart rates, the dull ringing that persisted for hours. The deeper effects were more complicated. Some men became more confident after surviving, interpreting the experience as evidence that U-596 was a lucky boat, that Lehmann-Willenbrock was a commander who could bring them home. Others became quietly more frightened, having confronted for the first time what it felt like to be hunted in a steel tube beneath a dark ocean. Lehmann-Willenbrock watched both responses with the attention of someone who understood that morale was a tactical resource as real as fuel and torpedoes. The patrol continued. There were further contacts, further decisions, further moments where the calculus of opportunity and risk played out in the compressed timetable of periscope observations and engine orders. What emerged over those weeks was not just a growing tonnage score, but a developing philosophy, a set of instincts and preferences that Lehmann-Willenbrock would refine across subsequent patrols, but that were already clearly legible in his first. He preferred patience over recklessness. He preferred certainty of shot over frequency of shot. He preferred the boat intact and the crew alive over the additional entry in a sinking log that might cost him either. These preferences were not timidity. They were the preferences of a man who understood that the weapon he commanded, the submarine itself, and the crew within it, was too valuable to expend carelessly. When U-596 returned to base from that first combat patrol, the debrief would have captured the bare outline: contacts made, torpedoes expended, results claimed, enemy response encountered. What the debrief could not fully capture was the texture of what had changed aboard that boat. The crew that came back was not the same crew that had left. They had been tested in the specific way that only combat tests a man, not the theatrical testing of the imagination, but the plain, physical, unambiguous testing of what a person actually does when the situation is genuinely dangerous. Lehmann-Willenbrock had been tested alongside them, and he had passed in ways that mattered to the men who had watched him. His reputation was not yet large. He was one commander among many in a fleet that was, at this stage, growing rapidly and producing results across the board. But within the flotilla, among the officers who exchanged information over meals and in briefing rooms, his name was beginning to carry a particular quality. He was the man who came back. He was the man who made decisions that looked, in retrospect, like the right ones. He was the man whose crew spoke of him in terms that were specific rather than generic. Not just a good commander, but a commander with identifiable habits, identifiable standards, identifiable thinking. In the submarine war, where the margin between a good commander and a dead one was sometimes nothing more than a single decision made well, that specificity meant a great deal. The lessons of that first patrol were not written in any manual. They lived in Lehmann-Willenbrock's developing instincts, in the adjustments he made to his own behavior, and in the revised mental models he carried back to the next patrol. He had learned that the enemy was real and competent. He had learned that his crew's physical and psychological limits were knowable, but required constant management. He had learned that his own capacity for stillness under pressure, for making deliberate choices when the impulse toward any action at all, screamed louder than rational thought, was genuine rather than assumed. He had not yet proven himself across the full arc of the war. No first patrol could do that. But he had proven something essential, that when the Atlantic demanded everything, Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock had more to give than most. There is a particular kind of education that no classroom can offer and no textbook can replicate. It comes only through repetition under pressure, through the accumulation of small, costly errors corrected in real time, until what was once instinct becomes method, and what was once method becomes mastery. By the time Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock returned from his early patrols aboard U-596, he carried that education inside him. He had felt the Atlantic's indifference to rank and training. He had watched Allied escorts respond to his attacks with increasing speed and ferocity, and he had survived, which, in the calculus of the U-boat war, meant he had earned the right to go back out and do it again. The question was no longer whether he could fight. The question was whether he could fight better, and whether better would be enough. The mid-Atlantic in the early 1940s was not a static battlefield. It shifted constantly, in weather, in light, in the rhythms of Allied shipping. Convoy routes were not random. They followed the logic of logistics, bending around known danger zones, adjusting to intelligence assessments, constrained by the geographic realities of ports, fuel ranges, and escort availability. A commander who understood those constraints could begin to anticipate them. Lehmann-Willenbrock studied what he had seen. He mapped, in his own mind, the patterns of the convoys he had encountered, their spacing, their speed, the predictable arcs of their escorts. the moments of vulnerability that opened briefly at dawn or dusk, before closing again like a wound. He was building something more durable than experience. He was building a system. The mechanics of a convoy attack in this period were deceptively straightforward on paper and almost impossibly complex in practice. A U-boat operating on the surface at night carried significant advantages: low profile, reasonable speed, the ability to close range before diving to attack. But those advantages evaporated the moment an escort detected the submarine, whether by radar, by visual sighting, or by the telltale disturbance of a wake under moonlight. The window between detection and destruction could be measured in seconds. What Lehmann-Willenbrock refined across these patrols was a precise understanding of that window, how wide it opened, how quickly it closed, and how to extract the maximum damage from the interval between. He was not reckless, he was calculating, and calculation at that speed looks very much like instinct to anyone watching from the outside. His approach to positioning evolved with each patrol. He understood that the ideal attack vector was not necessarily the most aggressive one. Coming in from directly ahead of a convoy exposed the U-boat to the overlapping watch arcs of multiple escorts. Coming in from the flanks, threading between the outer screen and the columns of merchant ships, required nerve and precision, but it offered angles of fire that were geometrically superior and escape routes that were marginally more survivable. He drilled his crew on these geometries. He expected his watch officers to see what he saw, not just the convoy itself, but the spaces within and around it, the corridors of relative safety and the dead zones where a mistake would be final. The crew of U-596 were not simply following orders, they were being taught to think. Coordination with other U-boats was emerging in this period as a defining feature of German submarine strategy. The concept of the wolf pack, Rudeltaktik, involved directing multiple boats against a single convoy, overwhelming its escorts through simultaneous or sequential attacks from different bearings. On paper, the logic was sound. In practice, the execution required a degree of communication and coordination that imposed its own risks. Radio transmissions, even brief ones, could be detected and triangulated by Allied direction-finding equipment. Every signal sent was a potential beacon. Lehmann-Willenbrock understood this tension acutely. He developed a working approach that combined strict radio discipline with precise adherence to pre-planned group positioning, minimizing transmissions while maximizing the tactical benefit of operating alongside other boats. He was not the architect of Rudeltaktik, but he was a skilled practitioner of it, and the distinction between those two roles matters enormously in the reality of combat. There were patrols during this period where the mathematics of the wolf pack worked almost as theorized. A convoy spotted and reported, other boats vectored in by command from shore, attacks staggered across the span of a night, so that the escorts were pulled first one direction and then another, never able to concentrate their full attention on any single threat. In those engagements, ships were lost by the Allied side in numbers that felt, from inside a U-boat's control room, like genuine strategic impact. Lehmann-Willenbrock was not immune to a sense of grim professional satisfaction in those moments. He had done his part, his crew had performed with precision, the boat had come home, but he was also beginning to see that the escorts were learning too, and that the satisfaction of any given patrol had to be weighed against what the next patrol might look like. The Allied response to the wolf pack was not immediate, but it was methodical. Escort commanders were studying the patterns of attack, just as Lehmann-Willenbrock was studying the patterns of defense. They recognized that a U-boat attacking on the surface was vulnerable to radar, and radar was improving. They understood that aggressive counterattacks after a torpedoing, rather than simply shepherding the convoy onward, could keep a U-boat deep and neutralized, even if they could not sink it outright. The logic of attrition worked both ways. For every convoy battle that cost the Allies merchant tonnage, there were accompanying lessons that fed back into doctrine, into training, into the slow accumulation of Allied tactical competence. Lehmann-Willenbrock could feel this accumulating competence in the way escorts responded to his attacks. Less hesitation, more coordination, patterns that suggested officers who were no longer improvising. He adapted, because adaptation was the only alternative to death. His evasion techniques after an attack became more sophisticated, varying depth, varying course, using the thermal layers of the Atlantic to deflect sonar returns, rationing battery power for maximum endurance at silent running speed. He trained his crew to operate in near-total silence during depth-charge attacks, to suppress the very human impulse to move, to react, to do something when the explosions walked closer. Stillness, he understood, was a tactical skill as demanding as any maneuver under fire. He enforced it not through punishment, but through patient, repeated demonstration, through the kind of authority that comes from a commander who has already proven he knows how to keep the crew alive. The mid-Atlantic convoys during this period also confronted Lehmann-Willenbrock with something that tactical refinement alone could not fully address: the sheer scale and endurance of Allied supply lines. Each convoy he engaged was one of many. Each ship he sank was replaced, not immediately, but steadily, by a shipbuilding capacity that bore no resemblance to anything Germany could field. He was not yet thinking in those terms with the clarity that hindsight provides, but a commander of his intelligence did not need hindsight to observe what was in front of him. The numbers of escorts were growing, the quality of those escorts was improving, the convoys kept coming, the arithmetic of the campaign was not moving in Germany's favor, even in the moments when individual patrols went well. What sustained him, and what sustained his crew through the grinding repetition of patrols that offered no guarantee of return, was not ideology, it was professionalism. The culture aboard U-596 under his command was one of mutual dependence rendered explicit. Every man understood that the competence of every other man stood between all of them and the ocean floor. This understanding stripped away the usual hierarchies of naval rank without eliminating the authority that the hierarchy served. Lehmann-Willenbrock led by example, but more than that, he led by clarity, clear orders, clear expectations, clear acknowledgement of what the crew had accomplished and what it had cost. Men followed him because he gave them the tools to survive, and because they believed, on the basis of evidence, that he was trying to bring them home. The patrols accumulated. The tonnage scores that Naval Command tracked with such bureaucratic diligence grew. Lehmann-Willenbrock's name circulated through the channels by which the Kriegsmarine identified its most capable commanders. Not yet legendary, but noticed. His methods were not exotic. He did not rely on exceptional personal daring, or on the kind of dramatic individual gesture that made for easy propaganda. He relied on preparation, on the systematic exploitation of tactical windows, on a crew trained to a standard that few submarine commands in any navy would have found unremarkable. That was precisely what made him effective, and precisely what made the recognition, when it came, feel less like reward than like the natural outcome of work done consistently well. The Atlantic did not grade on sentiment, it graded on results. But the results that mattered were not only the ones recorded in after-action reports. The results that would matter most, in the longer arc of this war, were the ones no single patrol could produce, the cumulative shift in the balance between the hunter and the hunted. Lehmann-Willenbrock had refined his methods to a considerable degree of excellence. He had learned to read the Atlantic's rhythms, to coordinate with other boats, to manage his crew through extremes of danger and exhaustion. He had built, across these patrols, something genuinely impressive, a working system of submarine warfare executed at a level of craft that would earn the attention of naval historians long after the war's outcome had made tactical excellence largely beside the point. The horizon, however, was not empty. Out there, closing at the pace of industrial production and organizational learning, were forces that no amount of individual method could ultimately hold at bay. The systematic hunt was still, for now, Lehmann-Willenbrock's hunt to run. That would not always be true. A promotion in the Kriegsmarine was never a simple ceremony. There were no brass bands waiting on the dockside, no long speeches echoing across a parade ground. For men who lived and fought beneath the surface of the Atlantic, recognition came quietly. A handshake from a superior officer, new orders pressed into the hand, and the weight of greater responsibility settling across the shoulders like a cold ocean current. For Lehmann-Willenbrock, the transfer to command of U-256 represented exactly that kind of wordless elevation. He had earned it through patience, through aggression precisely applied, through the kind of tactical intelligence that could not be taught in a classroom or extracted from a manual. The Kriegsmarine had watched his patrols with interest. Now they intended to make use of him on a larger scale. U-256 was a Type Vig boat, the workhorse of the German submarine fleet and the most numerous U-boat variant ever produced. On paper, she was not dramatically different from what Lehmann-Willenbrock had known before. The Type Vig had been refined over successive generations, ironing out engineering quirks and expanding operational range. But the fundamental architecture remained recognizable to any experienced U-boat man. She was roughly 67 meters from stem to stern. Her diesel engines could push her to better than 17 knots on the surface, while her electric motors gave her quiet, cautious movement in the depths. She carried 14 torpedoes and an 88mm deck gun, along with anti-aircraft armament that would grow more elaborate as the war progressed. What she offered Lehmann-Willenbrock was not novelty, but currency, a newer hull, a tighter mechanical history, and the implicit promise of a vessel that had not yet been worn down by the Atlantic's pitiless demands. The difficulty was the crew. A boat is nothing without the men who operate her. And when Lehmann-Willenbrock stepped aboard U-256, he encountered a reality familiar to any combat officer handed a fresh command in the middle of a war. These were not the seasoned sailors he had molded aboard his previous posting. Some were young enough that their faces still carried the unfinished quality of adolescence. Men who had completed their basic instruction ashore and aboard training vessels in the Baltic without yet understanding what the Atlantic would ask of them. Others were more experienced, but not yet shaped into a functioning unit, skilled in isolation, untested as a collective organism operating under depth charge attack at 200 meters below the surface, where panic is as lethal as any weapon the enemy can deploy. Lehmann-Willenbrock understood something that less thoughtful commanders sometimes missed. A submarine crew is not a collection of individual specialists, it is a single mechanism, and every component must respond to crisis without hesitation and without conscious thought. That kind of instinct cannot be delivered by lectures. It has to be built through repetition, through the gradual accumulation of shared experience, until each man knows his role so completely that his hands move before his mind has finished formulating the order. In the weeks following his assumption of command, Lehmann-Willenbrock drove his crew through training exercises with the kind of intensity that bordered on relentlessness. Emergency dive procedures were rehearsed until they were automatic. Damage control drills were conducted in simulated darkness, with men working by feel alone. Torpedo attack approaches were walked through step by step, then compressed again, until the sequence could be executed cleanly under pressure. There was a cultural dimension to this process as well, one that Lehmann-Willenbrock had developed across his earlier command experience and now applied with conscious deliberation. A crew that feared its commander might perform adequately under routine conditions, but it would fracture under the kind of sustained, grinding stress that convoy attacks produced. Fear breeds hesitation. Hesitation at depth, with propellers turning overhead and the hull groaning under hydrostatic pressure, is a death sentence written in seconds. What Lehmann-Willenbrock cultivated instead was something closer to confidence, not the reckless confidence of men who believe nothing can harm them, but the specific, grounded confidence of men who trust their commander's judgment and believe that if survival is possible, he will find the path to it. His manner in the control room was notable for its steadiness. He did not shout when the situation became dangerous. He spoke clearly. He expected his orders to be executed precisely, and he worked to make his crew feel that he was thinking 2 steps ahead of whatever threat was developing outside the hull. Shore Command had given him expanded operational responsibilities alongside the new posting. He was not simply being asked to take a boat to sea and bring it back with a respectable tonnage score. His success in earlier patrols had drawn attention to his capacity for understanding the structural logic of a convoy engagement, the way a large formation of merchant vessels and their escorts moved, breathed, and revealed its vulnerabilities over time. Flotilla Command wanted that understanding applied more broadly. He was expected to contribute to operational planning discussions, to share tactical observations that might refine how other boats approached their targets, and to carry a degree of intellectual authority that went beyond simply executing orders from Lorient or Brest. It was a significant shift from pure practitioner to something approaching practitioner-teacher, and it added a layer of complexity to his days that pure combat command had not required. The administrative burden alone was considerable. Training schedules had to be constructed and maintained. Equipment readiness had to be monitored. Reports had to be written in the formal, precise language that Flotilla Command expected, translating the chaotic reality of a combat patrol into the clean sequential narrative that planning officers could use. Through all of this, Lehmann-Willenbrock continued to prepare U-256 for operational deployment. The Atlantic was not waiting for him to finish his paperwork. The convoy routes were active, the tonnage war continued to grind forward, and the pressure from above to return capable boats to active patrol was constant and unrelenting. What struck many who served under him during this period was the degree to which he seemed to hold 2 contradictory requirements in simultaneous balance. He was training a crew that was not yet ready, while also being required to take that crew to sea before readiness was fully achieved. This was not unique to his situation. It was the chronic condition of the U-boat arm as it scaled rapidly during the years of peak German naval ambition. Boats were needed. Boats were built, crews were assembled and trained to the degree that time allowed, and then sent out into water that had no interest in their inexperience. The best a commander could do was compress the training process as aggressively as possible, identify which men learned fastest under pressure, and make certain that the key positions, the helmsmen, the torpedo operators, the damage control teams, were held by the most capable men available, however young they might be. Lehmann-Willenbrock's reputation within the flotilla was already substantial by the time he assumed command of U-256. Among fellow commanders, he was regarded as someone whose tactical assessments were worth hearing, whose accounts of patrol engagements contained genuinely useful operational detail rather than the vague impressionism that less analytical men sometimes offered. Among shore staff, he was seen as reliable in a specific and valuable sense, not merely brave, but consistently productive, someone who could be assigned difficult patrols with a reasonable expectation that the boat would return and that the crew would have learned something useful in the process. This reputation carried practical weight. It meant that when he raised concerns about crew readiness or equipment status, those concerns were taken seriously rather than dismissed as the standard complaints of an overcautious officer. He was not, however, above the structural constraints that bound every U-boat commander, regardless of reputation or record. Operational orders came from above, and the broad parameters of each patrol, the hunting grounds, the timing, the coordination with other boats, were determined by men at desks whose understanding of the Atlantic's daily reality was necessarily more abstract than his own. Lehmann-Willenbrock could influence those decisions at the margins through the quality of his post-patrol reports and through informal conversations with flotilla staff. He could not override them. The tension between tactical intelligence accumulated at the sharp end and strategic direction exercised from behind a desk was a permanent feature of the U-boat war, and it grew more acute as the conflict developed and the gap between German ambition and German capability began to widen in ways that the men at those desks were sometimes the last to acknowledge. Through the preparations and the administrative pressure and the relentless compression of training schedules, U-256 was being shaped into something genuinely capable. The crew that had seemed uncertain and unformed in those first weeks was beginning to coalesce. Men who had been strangers to one another were developing the particular intimacy of people who sleep within a meter of each other in a steel tube 60 meters beneath the surface, an intimacy built not on warmth but on total mutual dependence. Lehmann-Willenbrock could feel the unit beginning to function. He had experienced this process before, watched a crew find its coherence through repetition and shared tension, and he recognized the signs. The drills were running faster. The hesitations were disappearing. The right hands were moving to the right valves before the order was fully spoken. What none of them could know, what the tightest training and the sharpest tactical mind could not prepare them for, was the specific shape of what the Atlantic was about to become. The year they were preparing to operate in would not simply be more of what had come before. The ocean ahead of U-256 was changing in ways that favored neither the finest commander nor the best-trained crew, but rather the side with the most resources, the fastest engineers, and the widest industrial base. None of that was yet visible from the dockside at Brest, where the boat sat loading provisions and ammunition, her crew still carrying the particular quiet confidence of men who did not yet fully understand what was coming. Lehmann-Willenbrock may have sensed more than most. He was a careful observer, and careful observers tend to notice early when the advantages they have relied upon begin to erode. But the orders were written, the boat was ready, and the Atlantic was waiting with its characteristic indifference to human preparation. The Atlantic in 1942 belonged to the U-boats. In the 12 months that followed Germany's declaration of war against the United States, the underwater fleet prosecuted an offensive of such scope and ferocity that Allied shipping losses reached a crescendo that threatened to strangle the entire war effort. Between January and December of that year, German submarines sank more tonnage than in any other 12-month period of the entire conflict. For Lehmann-Willenbrock, commanding U-256, this year represented the apex of opportunity, a window of time in which skill, aggression, and tactical acuity could translate directly into operational success. The merchant convoys moving across the Atlantic were lightly escorted, often desperately so. The United States Navy, stretched across two oceans and unprepared for the scale of the U-boat threat that materialized on its doorstep, struggled to assemble sufficient destroyers, corvettes, and escort vessels to adequately protect shipping lanes. For the German submarines, 1942 felt less like warfare and more like a hunt against prey that possessed neither the numbers nor the coordination to mount an effective defense. The early months of 1942 saw the U-boat offensive reach into waters previously considered relatively safe. German submarines operated along the American coast itself, sinking merchant vessels within sight of coastal towns, their crews watching helplessly from beaches and harbors as burning ships illuminated the night sky. Lehmann-Willenbrock's patrols took him into these contested waters and beyond, into the central Atlantic where the most heavily laden convoys assembled for the transatlantic crossing. The tactical situation favored the submarine commander with nerve and adaptability. Convoys followed predictable routes, their courses constrained by geography and the requirement to rendezvous at fixed points. Once a U-boat found a convoy, it could shadow it, report its position to other boats by radio, and coordinate a massed attack that could overwhelm the escort screen. Lehmann-Willenbrock mastered this methodology. His patrols during 1942 demonstrated a growing sophistication in convoy interception, a willingness to pursue contacts across hundreds of kilometers of open ocean, and the tactical flexibility to adapt his approach based on escort composition and defensive tactics. What emerged was not merely a hunter, but a strategic asset, a single submarine captain whose decisions influenced the broader operational picture of the Atlantic campaign. The statistics of 1942 tell a story of apparent German invulnerability. The Kriegsmarine possessed fewer than 100 operational U-boats at the year's beginning, yet this relatively modest force sank over 6 million tons of Allied shipping. Lehmann-Willenbrock, operating U-256 throughout most of this period, contributed substantially to these figures. His patrol logs record a succession of merchant vessel sinkings, encounters with convoy escorts, and tactical decisions made in real time under conditions of extreme pressure and incomplete information. He developed a reputation among other submarine officers as a commander who combined technical competence with an almost instinctive understanding of naval gunnery and torpedo attack geometry. His crews developed confidence in his judgment, respect for his professionalism, and a sense that they served under someone who would maximize their chances of survival even while accepting the inherent lethality of submarine operations. The confidence was mutual. Lehmann-Willenbrock selected his officers with care, retained experienced petty officers, and built a command structure that could execute complex maneuvers under combat conditions. When a convoy appeared on the horizon, or when an escort vessel turned toward the U-boat with depth charges primed, U-256 responded with the coordinated precision of a unit that had trained together extensively and understood its commander's expectations without elaborate explanation. Yet beneath the surface of German success lay structural vulnerabilities that would eventually prove fatal to the entire U-boat campaign. The apparent invulnerability of 1942 rested on temporary advantages that were already beginning to erode. Allied shipbuilding capacity, particularly in the United States, was ramping up toward levels that would eventually exceed German sinking rates by factors of 5 or 6 to 1. The convoy escort vessels available to protect shipping were increasing in numbers, albeit slowly. More critically, Allied naval technology was advancing. Sonar sets were becoming more sensitive, their operators more skilled. Radar was appearing on escort vessels, providing warning of U-boat presence even in darkness or heavy weather. The Greenland Gap, the stretch of mid-Atlantic where air cover could not reach and where U-boats had operated with near impunity, would eventually be closed by the introduction of long-range patrol aircraft. Lehmann-Willenbrock, like other experienced submarine commanders, began to sense these changes during 1942's final months. The convoys seemed better organized, their escorts more aggressive, their tactics more coordinated. The American destroyers and escort vessels, at first seemingly clumsy and inadequate, demonstrated an increasing capacity for rapid response and effective depth charge attacks. The hunt that had seemed effortless in the early spring of 1942 had become progressively more challenging as the year progressed into autumn and winter. The operational tempo demanded by the German U-boat command contributed to the illusion of unlimited success. Lehmann-Willenbrock found himself in continuous rotation between patrols, maintenance periods, crew leave, and training exercises. The intervals between patrols compressed as the command structure pushed for maximum operational availability. New U-boats were being commissioned from the shipyards in unprecedented numbers, but this expansion created an operational culture that prioritized output over sustainability. Experienced captains like Lehmann-Willenbrock became increasingly valuable as training officers, yet the operational need for skilled commanders at sea meant they remained at sea for extended periods. The exhaustion was real, though professionalism and the demands of command left little room for it to surface. Lehmann-Willenbrock maintained his meticulous attention to detail, his analytical approach to tactical problems, and his capacity to make rapid decisions under combat stress. What may have been lacking was the margin for recovery that only extended shore leave could provide. The U-boat fleet as a whole operated under this accelerating tempo, and 1942 was the year when this relentless pace began to extract its toll in ways that would only become fully apparent in the campaigns to come. The psychological reality of 1942 diverged sharply from the strategic reality. For Lehmann-Willenbrock and his contemporaries, the year seemed to confirm that the U-boat was an essentially unconquerable weapon, that German submarines could impose an unsustainable supply burden on Britain and disrupt the entire American military mobilization. The tonnage-sunk figures dominated the internal assessments of success. The fact that individual U-boats were beginning to encounter more formidable opposition was acknowledged, but interpreted as challenges to be overcome through improved tactics and better training, not as harbingers of a fundamental shift in the balance of power. Lehmann-Willenbrock's reports from his patrols were factual and professional, but they reflected the perspective of a skilled operator observing the immediate tactical environment, rather than a strategic analyst contemplating the war's broader trajectory. This is not criticism but observation. The position of a submarine captain is inherently tactical. The view from beneath the surface of the Atlantic, through a periscope, is necessarily focused on the immediate threat and the immediate opportunity. Strategic exhaustion, industrial capacity, and the long-term mobilization curves that would ultimately determine the outcome remain distant abstractions from the perspective of someone fighting the immediate battle. Lehmann-Willenbrock's personal tonnage score accumulated rapidly during 1942. His attacking record, the tonnage attributed to his patrols on U-596 and subsequently on U-256, placed him among the more successful U-boat captains of this period. Success bred opportunity. Successful captains received better maintained boats, priority for shore maintenance, and the capacity to recruit and retain the best available personnel. The German Navy recognized achievement and rewarded it. Lehmann-Willenbrock's advancement to command of U-256 was itself a recognition of his growing reputation. The boat he inherited was new, well-equipped, and provided with a sufficiently experienced nucleus of officers and petty officers to allow him to shape the crew according to his preferences. More autonomously than many submarine captains, Lehmann-Willenbrock was permitted to determine his patrol areas, to adjust his approach based on reported convoy positions and escort compositions, and to make tactical decisions that might diverge from standing orders if the immediate tactical situation demanded adaptation. This autonomy was possible only because he had demonstrated the judgment to exercise it responsibly. The broader context of 1942 was the moment when the U-boat war seemed to offer Germany a path to victory, or at least to a negotiated settlement that might allow Germany to consolidate its continental European domination. If Britain could be strangled through starvation of raw materials and food supplies, if American war production could be prevented from reaching Britain and the Soviet Union, if the industrial capacity devoted to shipping could be redirected to military production, then perhaps the balance of the war could shift in Germany's favor. This strategic calculation, which drove the German High Command's commitment to the U-boat offensive, rested on assumptions about tonnage sinking rates, shipbuilding replacement capacity, and Allied morale that would prove increasingly divorced from reality. But during 1942, particularly in the first and middle portions of the year, the calculation seemed plausible. The tonnage figures came in month after month, each month exceeding the previous one, each figure suggesting that the critical threshold at which the Allies would be forced to curtail operations and reduce military aid to the Soviet Union was approaching. For Lehmann-Willenbrock, this strategic context provided the broader justification for the patrols he conducted, the merchant vessels he sank, and the crews of those vessels who perished in the freezing Atlantic. He was not merely a U-boat captain pursuing tactical victories. He was a strategist contributing, through his individual actions, to a campaign intended to achieve German strategic objectives. The human dimension of 1942 must be acknowledged, though it remains difficult to reconcile with the operational record. Lehmann-Willenbrock's patrols resulted in the sinking of merchant ships and the deaths of sailors, including those from neutral nations pressed into service aboard British and American vessels. The tonnage figures that dominated German strategic assessments represented hundreds of individual dramas, crews abandoning sinking ships into waters often cold enough to kill in minutes, lifeboats lost to heavy weather or to U-boats that surfaced among the survivors, the gradual expansion of the list of missing ships and lost seafarers that the Allies compiled with meticulous accuracy. Lehmann-Willenbrock's personal adherence to the prize rules, his reported practice of not attacking lifeboats or helpless survivors, was exceptional among U-boat captains and reflected personal moral choices that distinguished him operationally. Yet his operational record during 1942 remained that of a commander whose primary objective was to maximize the destruction of merchant shipping, and who succeeded in that objective with considerable skill. The ability to execute this role effectively while maintaining a sense of personal moral restraint is a paradox that historians and moral philosophers have struggled to resolve. What is clear is that Lehmann-Willenbrock navigated this contradiction without apparent evidence of internal moral collapse, maintaining his professionalism and his command effectiveness while operating within parameters that he had apparently established for himself regarding the treatment of the defeated and the drowning. The technological sophistication brought to 1942, operations represented the apex of first-generation submarine warfare. The Type 4 U-boat that Lehmann-Willenbrock commanded represented the evolutionary peak of the submarine design philosophy that had been dominant since World War I. The boats were fast enough to pursue convoys at the surface, maneuverable enough to conduct complex evasion tactics when attacked, and sufficiently robust to withstand moderate depth charge damage. The torpedoes, while still prone to mechanical failures that frustrated German captains and wasted valuable shots, possessed adequate range and explosive force to sink any merchant vessel and to damage or sink escort vessels. The command structure that coordinated multiple submarines through radio reports and Kriegsmarine operational orders was sophisticated for its time, allowing the concentration of boats against reported convoys and the tactical coordination of attacks. Lehmann-Willenbrock mastered all of these technological systems. His understanding of his boat's capabilities and limitations, his intuitive grasp of the tactical geometry involved in positioning a submarine for an attack run, and his ability to diagnose and compensate for mechanical problems contributed substantially to his operational success. Yet this technological sophistication was brittle. As Allied responses evolved, as countermeasures improved, and as the submarines themselves became physically worn by continuous operations, the advantages that the Type Vic had possessed in 1942 would prove increasingly illusory. The momentum of 1942 was sustained by operational pressure and organizational commitment that approached the point of unsustainability. Lehmann-Willenbrock found himself caught in a cycle of patrols and brief maintenance periods that left little room for reflection or recovery. The psychological demands of submarine command are extreme even in peacetime, when the risks of catastrophic failure remain constant and the responsibility for the lives of 50 to 60 crew members rests continuously on the captain's judgment. In wartime, with the constant threat of enemy action, the knowledge that each patrol might be the one from which the boat does not return, the accumulating stress becomes nearly unbearable. Yet professional discipline, the example of other commanders, and perhaps an internalized sense that weakness or doubt must be suppressed, allowed Lehmann-Willenbrock to continue functioning at high levels. What toll this exacted is unknowable. His records and memoirs suggest a man focused on the immediate tasks at hand, analytical in his approach to problems, and seemingly unaffected by the chronic fatigue that characterized the experience of submarine officers by 1942's end. Whether this reflected genuine psychological resilience or a practiced suppression of doubt and fear, the documentary record does not reveal. What is clear is that he remained operationally effective, that his crews continued to respond to his orders with precision and speed, and that his patrols continued to produce results that attracted attention and recognition from higher command. By the final months of 1942, the year of opportunity was drawing to a close, though few participants fully grasped this reality. The convoy escorts were becoming more aggressive and more effective. The losses being sustained by the U-boat fleet itself were beginning to climb, though they remained acceptable by German calculations that weighed each submarine's destruction cost against the tonnage of shipping it had sunk during its operational life. For Lehmann-Willenbrock, 1942 represented the full flowering of his abilities as a U-boat captain. He had refined his tactics, built a command team of considerable skill, and accumulated a record of success that placed him among the more capable submarine commanders of the Kriegsmarine. The Atlantic Ocean remained the hunting ground of German submarines. convoys crossed from North America to Britain, laden with fuel, ammunition, food, and the industrial sinews of Allied resistance. Lehmann-Willenbrock had learned to read their patterns as a huntsman reads animal tracks. The vast distances, the poor visibility, the inadequate escorts that screamed across the waves in small groups, all of these favored the U-boat. He could position his boat ahead of a convoy's path, wait in silence beneath the surface, and strike when merchantmen passed overhead like sheep moving through a ravine. For a brief window in the war, perhaps 18 months in duration, the mathematics of submarine warfare worked overwhelmingly in Germany's favor. Lehmann-Willenbrock had benefited from this window as much as any commander in the Kriegsmarine, but in the depths of his experience, he began to sense a change. The signals came first as subtle disturbances in the pattern of engagement. Escorts that had been predictable in their movements began to react faster to attack positions. A boat would announce its presence through a torpedo launch, only to find itself chased down by destroyers or corvettes, moving with uncanny precision toward its calculated location. Lehmann-Willenbrock observed that Allied escort commanders seemed to know not only where U-boats were operating, but where they would be. The probability of coincidence gave way to the certainty of detection. He began to study the problem with the methodical intensity that had made him a dangerous hunter. What were they using? How far could they see? In the confined spaces of U-256's wardroom, he turned the question over in his mind as he reviewed patrol reports from other boats, collating observations from the wireless network that connected Germany's far-flung submarine fleet. The first concrete evidence emerged from the experiences of other commanders. Reports began filtering back of submarines being located and attacked on the surface in darkness and poor visibility, conditions that should have rendered them invisible to enemy eyes. The escorts were converging on U-boat positions with a speed and accuracy that transcended the limitations of visual observation. Only once before had German naval officers encountered this phenomenon, during the earlier surface warfare campaign with battleships and cruisers, but the scale and frequency were now far greater. Someone was seeing in the dark. Someone was tracking targets beyond the horizon. The implications were staggering. If the Allies possessed a technology that could locate submarines beyond visual range, if they could do it routinely from aircraft and escort vessels, then the fundamental assumptions of U-boat warfare would need to be re-examined. Lehmann-Willenbrock shared these observations with his superiors, though the chain of command did not yet grasp the full magnitude of what was occurring. The answer, though it would not be fully understood in Berlin for months, lay in a technology that Germany had developed but had fatally neglected to deploy. Radar, the emission of radio waves and the interpretation of their reflections, had been turned into a weapon by British scientists working in concentrated secrecy. By the summer of 1942, escort vessels carried radar sets capable of detecting a submarine's conning tower at a distance of several thousand meters, even in darkness and fog. Aircraft, too, were being equipped with a more advanced radar carried in their fuselages, which could acquire targets from altitudes that placed them far beyond the reach of anti-aircraft guns. These devices did not yet blanket the Atlantic. Gaps remained, particularly in the mid-ocean region known as the Greenland Gap, where aircraft operating from Newfoundland or Iceland could not yet reach. But the gaps were shrinking with every month that passed. New escort vessels were entering service, each equipped with improved radio direction finding equipment that could detect a submarine's transmissions and home in on it. The walls of the cage were growing closer. Lehmann-Willenbrock adapted with the precision that had become his hallmark. He instituted new protocols for his boat. Transmissions were to be brief and infrequent. sent only when the tactical situation demanded it. The boat would remain submerged as much as possible, accepting the fuel cost and the reduced mobility that came with slow underwater progress. When surfaced, which was necessary for speed and for charging the electric batteries that powered the boat at depth, watches were doubled and redoubled. The smallest shift in light, the faintest outline of an aircraft on the horizon, would trigger a crash dive. Every man aboard U-256 understood the penalty for inattention. The relaxation of vigilance that had been survivable in 1941 and early 1942 became a death sentence by the end of the year. Lehmann-Willenbrock drove these lessons home through training and through the example of his own unwavering focus. Some crews found him demanding, inflexible in his insistence on procedure, but those who served under him also learned to survive. The technological advantage extended beyond detection into the realm of destruction. Allied depth charges had been crude instruments in the early war, largely ineffective against submarines that had any depth at all and that were properly handled. But as 1942 progressed, depth charges appeared in greater numbers, with improved fuse mechanisms that allowed them to explode at specified depths rather than detonating indiscriminately. More significantly, the Allies developed escort tactics based on the principle of the group rather than the individual. A single destroyer could be evaded by a skilled captain, but coordinated attacks from multiple escorts, all maintaining contact with the submarine, and all releasing depth charges in a pattern designed to trap and damage their target. These presented an entirely different problem. Lehmann-Willenbrock witnessed the evolution of these tactics in the patrol reports filed by his peers. He was not alone in recognizing the shift. Throughout the U-boat fleet, the best commanders began to realize that the era of the surface attack, where a submarine would engage a convoy in darkness and then escape at high speed on the surface, was coming to an end. The human dimension of this technological change was perhaps the most profound. In 1941, a U-boat crew could operate with the assumption that their boat was master of the waters it patrolled. Encounters with escorts were brief and often survivable. The boat would attack, and if circumstances became unfavorable, it would submerge and withdraw. The escort vessels lacked the ability to follow, and by the time any coordinated response could be mounted, the U-boat would be far away. But by 1942, this sense of invulnerability had begun to evaporate. Crews found themselves forced to remain submerged for extended periods, listening to the growing drone of aircraft engines overhead and the distant percussion of depth charges exploding at varying depths. The psychological toll was considerable. Men who had joined the submarine service with the confidence of youth now faced an enemy they could not see but could clearly sense. The boat became not a weapon of superiority, but a coffin with uncertain walls. The morale of the U-boat fleet, which had run high when victories came easily and losses were minimal, began to deteriorate. Lehmann-Willenbrock understood this dynamic intuitively, even if the High Command in Berlin continued to issue optimistic assessments of the submarine situation. His response to these changing circumstances was characteristic. Rather than retreat into passive acceptance, Lehmann-Willenbrock sought to exploit the new environment through superior execution of the tactics that remained viable. If the Allies were improving their ability to track U-boats on the surface, then submerged attacks became more valuable, even if they were more difficult to execute. If depth charges posed an increased danger, then the answer lay in deeper diving, more evasive maneuvering, and a more sophisticated understanding of the three-dimensional chess game that unfolded beneath the waves. He began to develop what would later be recognized as proto-submarine tactics. A boat that was detected should not immediately flee, but should instead alter its course to a new bearing, allowing the pursuing escorts to maintain their bearing on the original course while the submarine moved perpendicular to their predicted intercept. Evasion combined with counter-evasion, a psychological duel conducted through the medium of acoustic detection and maneuvering. These were not revolutionary concepts, but they were not widely practiced by the less skilled commanders who increasingly filled the ranks of the U-boat fleet as experienced captains fell in combat or were withdrawn to training roles. The morale of Lehmann-Willenbrock's crew aboard U-256 underwent a transformation during this period. The men sensed their captain's analytical response to the changing conditions. He did not dismiss the threat posed by Allied technology. Rather, he acknowledged it openly and then methodically addressed it through improved procedures and training. This combination of realism and active problem-solving engendered confidence. The crew knew their boat and their captain were not invulnerable, but they also knew that their survival was being fought for with intelligence and skill. The boat developed a reputation, even within the flotilla system, as a command where the men stood a better chance of seeing the war's end than they did in other submarines. This reputation would prove largely justified. Of the crew members who served under Lehmann-Willenbrock throughout his operational career, a significantly higher proportion would survive the war than was the case for U-boat crews commanded by officers who lacked his adaptive capacity or his commitment to crew welfare. By the end of 1942, Lehmann-Willenbrock's growing mastery of the changing tactical environment was evident in his patrol results. Where other boats found their success rates declining sharply, his maintained a plateau of effectiveness. He had sunk merchant tonnage valued in the hundreds of thousands of tons by this point, and his loss ratios, the percentage of patrols completed to successful attacks delivered, remained favorable. But he was acutely aware that he was operating against a deteriorating backdrop. The Allies were not standing still. Every month brought new escort vessels into service, each equipped with superior technology. Aircraft coverage of the Atlantic, once limited to narrow corridors around Britain and North America, was expanding steadily. The Greenland Gap, that precious expanse of mid-ocean where submarines could surface and move at speed without fear of air attack, was shrinking. Intelligence reports from Berlin, when they were not colored by wishful thinking, suggested that the enemy was producing escort vessels and aircraft at a pace that dwarfed German shipyards. It was becoming mathematically clear that time was not on Germany's side in the submarine war, though this reality had not yet penetrated the upper levels of the Nazi military command. Lehmann-Willenbrock's observations during this period would later be recognized by historians and naval analysts as among the most prescient commentary on the Atlantic U-boat campaign. Unlike some of his contemporaries, who continued to believe that technological and tactical solutions could restore the submarine's mastery of the ocean, Lehmann-Willenbrock came to understand that the U-boat's window of operational advantage was closing permanently. The Allies possessed a superior industrial base, better resources for research and development, and an increasingly effective integration of multiple technological systems: radar, radio direction finding, depth charges, escorts, and aircraft, into a unified defensive network. Against this network, even an excellent submarine commander was merely slowing the inevitable. The best he could accomplish was to extract maximum value from the time that remained and to ensure that his crew survived through superior tactics and meticulous attention to the details of submarine warfare. It was a harsh calculation, but it was also a realistic one. In the shadows of the Atlantic, as 1942 turned toward 1943, the golden age of the U-boat was ending. Those commanders who recognized this fact and adapted accordingly, would be the ones to survive and to preserve their crews. Lehmann-Willenbrock was among the few who understood this truth while the war was still being fought, rather than in the retrospective clarity of historical analysis. By early 1943, the Atlantic had become a different hunting ground. The comfortable arithmetic of the previous year, when a U-boat could surface among merchant vessels and pick targets almost at leisure, had evaporated. Allied escorts had multiplied. Their tactics had hardened. Their technology had taken a leap that few in the German Navy had fully anticipated. It was into this transformed battlefield that Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock and the crew of U-256 now sailed, and what followed would test not merely their courage, but their ability to function as a coordinated organism under stress that pushed past fear into a realm of pure survival instinct. The convoy encounters of 1943 were nothing like the earlier patrols, where once a U-boat captain might approach from range, take his time, and deliver a calculated strike. The new reality demanded penetration through defensive screens that were tighter, more reactive, and armed with weapons of increasing sophistication. The escort ships no longer hunted individually. They worked in patterns. They communicated by radio. They deployed depth charges in coordinated salvos rather than scattered volleys. And they had learned to follow the acoustic signatures that submarines left behind, using new detection equipment that operated beneath the surface where once silence had been sanctuary. Lehmann-Willenbrock recognized immediately that the old calculus of engagement had shifted. Aggression remained necessary, but so did an entirely new species of caution. The margin between aggressive success and catastrophic failure had compressed to something paper-thin. One particular engagement in the spring of that year illustrated the new equation with brutal clarity. U-256 located a slow convoy moving northeast, heavily laden merchant vessels surrounded by an escort screen of perhaps 8 vessels. The composition itself was telling. The escorts included not merely smaller corvettes, but a larger warship that carried the kind of armament package that could damage or destroy a submarine if contact became direct. Lehmann-Willenbrock made his approach in daylight, submerged, calculating angles and distances with the precision that had become his trademark. His periscope work was methodical. His crew moved through their stations with the economy of motion that comes from hundreds of hours of repetition, and the knowledge that seconds wasted could mean the difference between sinking a target and being sunk oneself. The attack came at the closing moment of afternoon, when light levels made periscope observation difficult for the escorts, while still offering enough illumination for the U-boat's attack calculations. 2 torpedoes left the tubes in rapid succession. They ran true. One struck a merchant vessel amidships, the detonation a dull concussion that travelled through the water and shook U-256's hull like a gong. But in that same moment, the convoy's escorts reacted with a coordination that showed how thoroughly Allied anti-submarine doctrine had evolved. One of the escort vessels, an armed trawler fitted with modern detection equipment, had fixed the U-boat's position during the approach. The moment the torpedoes fired, the escorts knew approximately where the threat lay. They converged on U-256's position with the ruthlessness of predators closing on wounded prey. Lehmann-Willenbrock had seconds to respond. The first depth charge pattern detonated below him, the concussions violent enough to throw the crew against their stations, to shatter glass gauges, and to open pinhole leaks in the hull that immediately began to weep salt water onto vital equipment. The boat dove deeper, Lehmann-Willenbrock ordering the destruction of all unnecessary electrical equipment, riding down into the darker water where the escort's new detection equipment became less precise. But the escorts were not finished. They turned in coordinated arcs around the submarine's last known position, laying patterns of depth charges that created a zone of destruction that seemed to expand with each new salvo. The noise inside U-256 became overwhelming. A chorus of mechanical chaos punctuated by the deafening cracks of explosions and the groaning of the pressure hull as it flexed and strained against forces that sought to crush it. What separated Lehmann-Willenbrock from captains who were lost in those same months was his ability to remain functionally calm in that maelstrom of noise and shock. While crews aboard other boats descended into panic, sailors vomiting from fear and shock, officers shouting contradictory orders, Lehmann-Willenbrock maintained the voice and demeanor of a man who remained in command of circumstances rather than being controlled by them. He ordered silent running, a condition where every non-essential system was shut down to minimize the acoustic signature the boat produced. He managed trim precisely, using minute adjustments to maintain depth and stability. He kept the crew focused on their individual responsibilities rather than allowing attention to fracture into collective terror. Below, in the engineering spaces, technicians worked to seal leaks, to reroute electrical power around damaged sections, to keep the battery functioning and the motors turning. In the control room, young men barely out of their teens sat at their stations, muscles rigid with tension, hands steady only because they had rehearsed these motions so many times that training had overridden the voice in their minds, screaming that they were going to die. The depth charge attack continued for nearly 2 hours. Wave after wave, the escorts above kept searching the water, kept laying charges in patterns that swept gradually across the area where U-256 was hiding. The boat sustained damage with each detonation. A pipe burst in the engine room, venting compressed air and forcing a rapid seal-off of that section. 2 of the storage batteries began leaking acid, creating a chemical hazard that forced the crew to work in breathing apparatus. The hydroplane controls became sluggish from impact shock. The radio transceiver was rendered completely inoperable, and yet U-256 remained intact. The pressure hull, that incredible feat of engineering and metallurgy, held. The crew, despite every impulse toward collapse, continued to function. Lehmann-Willenbrock's insight during that attack proved transformative for how U-256 operated in subsequent engagements. He recognized that the escort's search patterns operated on assumptions about submarine behavior. They expected the boat to attempt escape, to run ahead or to the sides of the convoy, to create distance. Instead, Lehmann-Willenbrock held position almost directly beneath the point of the first attack, a decision that seemed counterintuitive but that made precise tactical sense. The escorts were searching in expanding arcs, assuming forward motion. A boat that simply waited, that allowed the sound of the escort ships to move away before making any movement, would be missed in the expanding search. It was a gamble. If the escorts reversed course or changed their search pattern, U-256 would be positioned directly where the next pattern of charges would fall. But Lehmann-Willenbrock calculated correctly that the escorts would follow their doctrine rather than adapting to unconventional behavior. When the escort vessels finally withdrew, convinced that the U-boat had either escaped or been destroyed, U-256 remained silent and motionless for another full hour before Lehmann-Willenbrock ordered the boat to come about and move away at minimal speed. The damage assessment that followed revealed a vessel that had sustained injuries serious enough to require months of dock repair, but it was also a vessel that had survived an encounter that had killed many other submarines in those months. The crew emerged from their stations exhausted and shaken but unbroken. More than that, they had crossed a threshold. They had experienced the worst that the war could deliver and had endured. That knowledge, that simple fact of survival, created a bond among the crew that transcended normal naval hierarchy. The tactical lessons Lehmann-Willenbrock extracted from that engagement circulated throughout the U-boat fleet, passed officer to officer, crew to crew. His innovations in crisis management and damage control became foundational doctrine. He had proven that survival under overwhelming odds was possible if the commander remained calm and if the crew was trained to respond to crisis through established protocols rather than through panic. He had demonstrated that sometimes the correct response to an attack was not to flee but to hide, to become so small and insignificant that the hunter's search passed over the prey. These were not concepts that appeared in the official training manuals, but they were ideas that spread because they worked, because men who absorbed them lived, and because in the submarine war, survival itself was the ultimate currency of credibility. But even as Lehmann-Willenbrock's tactical innovations kept U-256 in service longer than many sister boats, the larger trajectory remained unchanged. The intensity of escort forces continued to increase. The technology continued to improve. The numbers of German submarines continued to decrease, not because of tactical brilliance at the periscope, but because the industrial and logistical capacity of the Allied powers was simply too vast to overcome through any amount of individual skill. U-256 would survive 1943 and continue operating into 1944, but the boat was being patched and repaired with increasing frequency. The crew was aging and exhausted. Replacement sailors arriving from training were arriving with fewer and fewer weeks of instruction. The war was beginning to show, not just in the steel of the submarine, but in the weariness of every man aboard. What Lehmann-Willenbrock had accomplished in the crucible of 1943 combat operations was not to alter the outcome of the submarine war. No single captain, no matter how skilled or how innovative, could have done that. What he had accomplished was to keep his boat and his crew alive in conditions that were killing most other boats and their crews. He had extended the operational life of U-256 through the period of maximum danger. He had created a culture aboard that vessel where crisis response was trained and practiced rather than improvised in panic. And he had demonstrated that even when the broader circumstances were becoming overwhelmingly unfavorable, individual excellence in execution and individual responsibility toward the crew could still matter. That lesson, learned in the depths of the Atlantic under the hammer of depth charges and the weight of hunted desperation, would be one of the most enduring aspects of his legacy. Beneath the surface of the Atlantic, men lived in spaces no wider than a coffin and no taller than a crouching man. The submarine was not a vessel designed for comfort or mercy. It was a machine of steel and pressure, where a single puncture wound meant drowning in darkness, where mechanical failure transformed the crew into corpses sealed in a metal tomb. In such an environment, command became less about authority and more about the ability to hold together human beings on the edge of despair. Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock understood this in a way that many of his contemporaries did not. His approach to leadership was built not on distance or tyranny, but on something far more calculated and ultimately more effective. He made his men believe they had a genuine chance of survival. This was not sentimentality. It was the foundation of everything that allowed U-256 to return from patrol after patrol, battered but intact, when so many other boats did not. The contrast between Lehmann-Willenbrock and other submarine commanders was visible to anyone who moved between vessels. Some captains ruled through fear alone, demanding absolute obedience while maintaining an emotional detachment that bred resentment in crowded quarters. Others led from the front with such reckless aggression that they burned through crews like coal in a furnace, gaining tonnage at the cost of men's lives spent with careless abandon. Lehmann-Willenbrock did neither. His men reported that he knew many of them by name, and not in the performative way of a captain making rounds. He remembered small details, which men suffered from claustrophobia, which ones had families waiting in Hamburg or Bremen, whose hands shook during the first depth charge attack. This knowledge was not gathered from sentiment, but from genuine observation. He walked through the boat regularly, not as an inspector, but as someone trying to understand the human machinery he depended upon. When a young rating made a mistake, Lehmann-Willenbrock's response was predictable. He would identify the error, explain why it mattered, and then trust the man to correct it. A second mistake brought correction. A third brought reassignment. But the framework was always one of training, not humiliation. The practical systems he implemented aboard U-256 reflected this philosophy translated into operational reality. Lehmann-Willenbrock instituted mandatory rest rotations that were unusual for their strictness. Men who worked the critical stations, the hydroplane operators, the sonar listeners, the torpedo men, rotated off duty at fixed intervals regardless of patrol intensity. Other captains viewed this as weakness, as a failure to maintain aggressive pressure. Lehmann-Willenbrock understood that exhaustion was the precursor to the kind of catastrophic error that killed submarines. A hydroplane operator who had been awake for 36 hours straight would make the misjudgment that sent the boat into a fatal dive. A sonar operator running on nothing but stimulants would miss the sound of an approaching destroyer. The men understood this logic because he explained it to them. The rotation system was not presented as a privilege granted by a benevolent captain. It was presented as a tactical necessity. Men respected the honesty of that framing far more than they would have respected a captain claiming to care about their welfare. Safety protocols aboard U-256 were maintained with an almost obsessive attention to detail. Every valve was checked not once but twice before critical operations. Every seal was inspected before a dive. Every circuit was tested before weapons were loaded. Lehmann-Willenbrock enforced these procedures with a kind of relentless consistency that could frustrate younger officers who saw them as slowing patrol operations. He would delay an attack by several hours to ensure that torpedo guidance systems were absolutely functional. He would order resurfacing to vent the boat properly, rather than risk remaining underwater with degraded air quality. To the impatient, this seemed cautious to the point of weakness. To the men who survived, it seemed like genius. The boats that cut corners on maintenance, that skipped steps to save time, were the boats that disappeared. Lehmann-Willenbrock's crews understood that they were alive because their captain refused to pretend that shortcuts were acceptable. His relationship with the crew extended into territory that was genuinely unusual for a German naval officer operating under Nazi command structure. The submarine service was technically subject to the same ideological requirements as the rest of the military, yet the confined spaces and shared danger created circumstances that sometimes operated under different rules. Lehmann-Willenbrock never indoctrinated his men with political propaganda. He did not mandate attendance at ideological lectures. He did not report crew members for expressions of doubt or dissent, provided those expressions did not undermine operational security or safety. This was not because he was a closeted opponent of the regime. There is no evidence of such conviction, but because he recognized that a submarine crew's loyalty to the captain mattered infinitely more than their loyalty to an abstraction 3,000 meters above their heads. The men served Lehmann-Willenbrock, and their commitment to him ensured they would follow orders when every instinct screamed at them to panic. That loyalty was more valuable than any amount of Nazi fervor. The balance he maintained between ruthlessness and humanity was perhaps most visible during moments of discipline and accountability. When errors occurred that endangered the boat, Lehmann-Willenbrock's response was swift and unforgiving by the standards of normal naval hierarchy. A man who fell asleep at a critical station could face serious consequences. A mechanic who failed to properly maintain equipment would find himself reassigned or even recommended for transfer. But this ruthlessness was never personal, never punitive for its own sake. Lehmann-Willenbrock distinguished between carelessness that reflected individual failure and circumstances that reflected systemic problems. If multiple men were falling asleep at their stations, he examined the work schedule and reduced it. If equipment maintenance was degrading, he looked at the training protocols and strengthened them. This approach meant that his men understood discipline as a tool for keeping them alive, not as an expression of the captain's ego or power. They could accept harsh correction because they knew the correction was aimed at their survival, not at satisfying some authoritarian impulse. The psychological dimension of Lehmann-Willenbrock's command style deserves particular attention because submarines were fundamentally psychological arenas as much as they were tactical platforms. A crew that was terrified would make mistakes. A crew that was hopeless would lose cohesion. A crew that did not trust their captain would not function at the critical moments when functioning meant the difference between surfacing and sinking. Lehmann-Willenbrock's visibility aboard the boat, his obvious competence during crisis situations, and his willingness to admit limitations when they existed, these things accumulated into something that subordinates called confidence. When depth charges fell around the boat and the hull groaned under pressure, Lehmann-Willenbrock's calm voice giving orders was not dramatic or theatrical. It was simply factual. He did not pretend that the situation was not dangerous. He simply communicated that he had encountered this before and had a methodology for response. This communicated competence was worth more than false reassurance. There were men who served aboard U-256 who survived the war, and their recollections provide the most direct evidence of Lehmann-Willenbrock's impact on crew morale and function. They described an officer who was strict but fair, demanding but not cruel, technically excellent, and willing to explain his decisions to officers under his command. They described someone who pushed them toward excellence, not through insult or threat, but through the quiet, irresistible force of example. When the boat encountered its closest approaches to destruction, when the hull was cracking under depth charge explosions and men were bleeding from ruptured eardrums, Lehmann-Willenbrock was where officers and crew expected him to be, present, directing action, and communicating through his conduct that the situation could be survived. The men who operated the submarines did not require their captain to love them. They required him to be competent, to value their lives as a strategic asset, and to lead by methods that made sense in the context of their shared danger. The effectiveness of Lehmann-Willenbrock's approach was measurable in statistical terms that go beyond any individual patrol or sinking. The crew retention rate aboard U-256 was significantly higher than aboard comparable submarines in the same flotilla during the same operational period. Men requested to continue serving under him when rotation was an option. The casualty rate among his experienced crew was lower than the fleet average, not because he was more cautious overall, but because he managed risk in ways that preserved skilled personnel. The boat itself, while damaged on numerous occasions, was returned to port and repaired rather than lost, in part because the crew's cohesion and training allowed them to execute complex emergency procedures under extreme conditions. When historians and naval analysts examine the question of what separated some U-boat captains from others in terms of operational success, they often fixate on tactical innovation or aggressive spirit. But the truth includes something less dramatic and more fundamental: the ability to keep a crew together, functioning, and psychologically intact in an environment that was designed to break all three. The tragedy of Lehmann-Willenbrock's command philosophy was that it could not ultimately overcome the larger historical forces arrayed against it. A submarine captain's excellence in training and leading his crew could not compensate for the fact that by 1943 and 1944, the Atlantic had become a shooting gallery in which German submarines were the targets. Men who were well trained and well led still died when their boat was caught on the surface by aircraft they could not outrun. Men who trusted their captain implicitly still drowned when Allied destroyer escorts achieved coordinated attacks faster than any human response could counter. Lehmann-Willenbrock's methods created the conditions for survival, but they could not guarantee it in a war where the material balance had shifted decisively against Germany. The very men who testified to his leadership skills often did so as survivors of a war that killed the vast majority of submarine crews. His humanity aboard the boat could not change the fact that the boat itself had become a death trap in the larger operational environment. What remains clear is that Lehmann-Willenbrock represented a particular model of military command that transcended ideology while operating within its constraints. He was not a resistance fighter or a secret opponent of the Nazi regime. He was a professional naval officer who understood that the microcosm of a submarine required leadership principles that were fundamentally about competence, fairness, and respect for the human beings under his command. Whether such principles could have emerged from someone without his particular background and psychology is unknowable. Whether they could have been more widely adopted within the submarine service is also unknowable. What is demonstrable is that when a captain approached his crew not as expendable tools, but as skilled personnel whose lives constituted an irreplaceable asset, the results manifested in ways that were tangible: better decision-making, faster response to emergencies, and a cohesion that allowed men to endure what was virtually endurable. In the metal coffins that constituted the U-boat fleet, Lehmann-Willenbrock made men believe they could die less easily, and in the context of that war, belief itself became a form of survival. By the spring of 1943, the Atlantic Ocean had become a graveyard. Where once German submarines had hunted with near-total freedom, moving through merchant convoys like wolves through a flock, the waters now belonged to something far more formidable. The men aboard U-256 understood this change not as a theory passed in tactical discussions, but as a lived terror that redefined every moment of their patrols. Lehmann-Willenbrock had commanded his boat through the golden years when tonnage accumulated like currency, when success was measured not in survival, but in the weight of ships sent to the bottom. Now he would face a different kind of command, one that demanded not triumph, but the management of catastrophic decline. The Greenland Gap, that oceanic corridor through which U-boats had passed almost unmolested for 2 years, was closing. Within weeks it would cease to exist altogether, and with it would vanish the last refuge for German submarines operating in the Atlantic theatre. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. In the single month of March 1943, the U-boat fleet sank more than 500,000 tons of Allied shipping, a figure that seemed to vindicate the entire strategic gamble on submarine warfare. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding the U-boat force, believed the tipping point was near, that one more surge of coordinated attacks would break British and American resolve to supply their Atlantic lifelines. The convoy system, despite its improvements, still presented vulnerabilities, gaps where surface raiders and submarines could achieve overwhelming local advantage. The convoy on 192, proceeding westward from Liverpool toward North America, became the crucible in which this final fantasy would be tested and shattered. Lehmann-Willenbrock was among the commanders vectored toward this target. U-256, positioned as part of a coordinated wolf pack that represented the last great organized offensive of the U-boat arm. The battle that followed in May of 1943 would demonstrate the vast shift in the balance of naval warfare, a shift that no amount of courage or tactical brilliance could overcome. The mechanics of this transformation had been developing for months, accumulating like pressure behind a dam. The Allies had gradually penetrated the secrets of German radio communications, accessing the Enigma cipher through intelligence work that would remain classified for decades after the war. High-frequency direction-finding equipment, mounted on escort vessels, allowed them to locate U-boats by radio signals with increasing accuracy. Most critically, the development of long-range aircraft modified with new radar systems meant that the air gap in the mid-Atlantic, the vast stretch of ocean beyond the reach of land-based patrol planes, was shrinking rapidly. Escort carriers, small flat-top vessels that could carry a dozen or more aircraft, began appearing in convoy screens where previously only destroyers and corvettes had provided protection. These were not the armored behemoths of the fleet train, but hastily converted merchant vessels, improvised and vulnerable, yet armed with aircraft that could attack U-boats from altitudes and distances that submarines could not reach with their anti-aircraft guns. For Lehmann-Willenbrock and his peers, each new patrol brought encounters with these weapons, sudden appearances of aircraft that forced emergency dives and threatened the boat with destruction from above, a threat that no amount of evasion and depth control could entirely escape. When U-256 reached its patrol area in May 1943, the waters seemed almost normal. Convoys still moved, still presented targets, still offered the possibility of success. Lehmann-Willenbrock had conducted dozens of patrols now, and his instincts for finding prey and evading pursuit had been honed through repetition and survival. The crew aboard U-256 had learned the rhythms of their commander, the precise moment when caution would give way to aggression, the timing required to position themselves for attack without revealing their position to the enemy. They were efficient, this crew, cold in their execution, asking no questions about the nature of their targets or the circumstances of their deaths. Such questions had no place aboard a combat submarine where fear was the baseline emotion and discipline the only antidote to panic. Yet even these experienced men began to notice the changes. The way the sky was never entirely empty now, the increased frequency of depth charge attacks from multiple escorts, the coordinated tactics that seemed to anticipate their movements. The golden age of submarine warfare, the age when skill and boldness could reliably generate success, was entering its final weeks. The convoy encounter came with shattering intensity. Multiple U-boats formed a loose ring around the merchant ships and their escorts, and Lehmann-Willenbrock maneuvered U-256 into attack position during the darkness of late evening. The torpedoes fired cleanly, and two merchant vessels exploded in succession, their hulls torn open, their cargoes and crews consigned to the cold Atlantic. For a moment, the familiar exultation of success surged through the boat, the knowledge that the attack had worked, that skill and timing and courage had produced a tangible result. Then the escorts responded with a ferocity and coordination that transformed the celebration into desperate survival. Hedgehog projectiles, a new anti-submarine weapon that rained explosive charges across a wider pattern than conventional depth charges, rained down around the U-boat. Lehmann-Willenbrock ordered an emergency dive, pushing U-256 deeper into the black water. But the hits came anyway, concussion waves that shook the boat and sent men sprawling. The damage was severe, the torpedo tubes unserviceable, the batteries damaged, the hull itself compromised by the shock waves. What should have been a moment of victory transformed instead into a desperate race against the clock, a nighttime withdrawal at minimal speed, while the escorts hunted blindly through the darkness above. The psychological impact of this encounter rippled through Lehmann-Willenbrock's understanding of the war at sea. He had witnessed his own boat nearly destroyed not by some overwhelming enemy force or superior naval engagement, but by the coordinated tactics and new weapons of escorts that his service had previously handled with relative ease. The Allies were not simply fighting harder or with greater numbers, though they were doing both. They were fighting smarter, exploiting technological advantages that the German submarine force could not match. The Enigma communications remained secret to the Germans, but the directional finding equipment and the aircraft were plainly visible, and their effects were undeniable. Subsequent patrols confirmed the trend without variation. Each time U-256 surfaced or attempted to attack, it faced an exponentially greater risk of detection and assault. The Greenland Gap, that stretch of open ocean between the range of Allied air patrols from North America and the range of those operating from the British Isles, shrank week by week as new bases were established in Iceland and new aircraft with greater range entered service. By late May and early June of 1943, the gap had ceased to exist as any meaningful refuge. The losses accelerated with horrifying speed. 41 U-boats were sunk in May 1943 alone, a figure that dwarfed the previous records of the U-boat force. In June, the losses continued. Each boat that departed on patrol representing a gamble in which the odds had shifted catastrophically against the submarine. Young commanders, some with only a fraction of Lehmann-Willenbrock's experience, were dispatched with crews that had received abbreviated training because the pressure to maintain patrol schedules overrode concerns about crew preparation. The elite status of the U-boat service, the sense among recruits that joining the submarines meant joining an exceptional brotherhood of warriors, gave way to a grim understanding that these boats were now death traps. The propaganda that emanated from Berlin, the celebrations of tonnage sunk and convoys scattered, rang increasingly hollow against the mounting evidence of catastrophe. Lehmann-Willenbrock watched younger officers depart for their first patrols and understood with chilling clarity that the vast majority would not return. The mathematics of warfare had shifted, transformed by industrial capacity and technological innovation, in ways that no amount of individual courage could reverse. The final patrols of U-256 in 1943 reflected this grim reality with stark clarity. Gone were the extended hunting voyages that lasted weeks, moving slowly through rich waters, stockpiling targets for maximum effect. Instead, the boat was dispatched on shorter patrols, sometimes recalled after only days at sea when the command structure concluded that the risks had become excessive. Lehmann-Willenbrock found himself operating in a reactive stance, searching for targets but constantly forced to submerge, constantly evading, constantly calculating whether an attack could be executed without prohibitive risk. The crew's morale, which had sustained itself through previous periods of difficulty, through the knowledge that skill and vigilance could produce success, began to fray. The sailors and officers aboard U-256 were among the most capable in the fleet, yet their capabilities seemed increasingly irrelevant to their survival. They could be the finest submarine crew in all of Europe and still be sunk by an aircraft they could not see until it was already attacking, or by a coordinated escort group that could track their every movement through technological means the Germans did not possess. The decision to withdraw U-256 from active patrol operations came not as a sudden order, but as an inevitable conclusion that senior commanders could no longer ignore. The boat had accumulated damage across multiple patrols, and the cost of repairs had become increasingly difficult to justify when the likelihood of the boat surviving its next patrol had dropped below acceptable thresholds. Lehmann-Willenbrock's tonnage score, the measure by which submarine commanders were evaluated and ranked, stood at approximately 100,000 tons across his patrols, a figure that placed him among the most successful U-boat aces of the entire war. Yet this accomplishment, which should have been a matter of pride and distinction, instead served as a reminder of the window through which he had operated, the brief span of time when submarine commanders could achieve such results without encountering the overwhelming defensive apparatus that now protected every convoy. The withdrawal of U-256 did not mark the end of Lehmann-Willenbrock's service, but it did mark the end of an era. The commander who had learned and mastered the tactics of the Atlantic Undersea War would now find his remaining wartime service confined to training, administration, and observation, watching from the shore as the U-boat fleet he had known was systematically destroyed. The collapse of the Wolfpack system, the coordinated attacks that had once seemed to offer the promise of unlimited success, was complete by autumn of 1943. The convoys still moved across the Atlantic, still carried supplies and troops to the European theaters, but now they moved under a protective umbrella that the U-boats could not penetrate without accepting prohibitive losses. The strategic gamble that had animated German naval planning, the belief that unrestricted submarine warfare could choke off Britain and prevent American reinforcement of the European theatre, had failed. It had failed not because of poor execution by men like Lehmann-Willenbrock, who had done everything that military discipline and courage could demand. It had failed because the Allies possessed greater resources, greater industrial capacity, and technological innovations that proved insurmountable. The Greenland Gap, which had represented hope and possibility for 2 years, now represented only memory, a reminder of a moment when the balance of forces had seemed different, when individual skill and determination could shape outcomes on a strategic scale. For Lehmann-Willenbrock himself, the transition from operational commander to training officer and instructor represented a profound disorientation. He possessed knowledge that was invaluable, experience that no textbook could teach, wisdom earned through exposure to combat and through the successful navigation of threats that had claimed the lives of many of his peers. Yet this knowledge would now be directed toward training crews for boats that had exponentially lower odds of survival than any he had commanded. He would attempt to pass along methods and tactics that had worked in 1942 and early 1943, knowing all the while that these methods were becoming obsolete, that the young officers and men he was training would face an enemy that had evolved beyond the parameters of his accumulated experience. The efficiency with which he had conducted his patrols, the ruthlessness with which he had coordinated attacks, the discipline with which he had maintained his boat and crew, all of these qualities that had made him an exceptional submarine commander would soon be rendered largely irrelevant. The war at sea had transformed into something different. something in which the outcome was no longer in doubt, and in which even the finest commanders could only hope to delay the inevitable. The tide that had turned by mid-1943 was not reversible. Lehmann-Willenbrock understood this with a clarity that not all German commanders would allow themselves to acknowledge. The U-boat fleet would continue operations, would conduct patrols into 1944 and even into 1945, would continue to sink ships and claim lives, but these would be the death throes of a weapon system that had been superseded. The Greenland Gap had closed, the escort carriers had multiplied, the long-range aircraft had spread across the Atlantic, and the coordinated tactics that the Allies had developed, supported by intelligence information the Germans did not know they were providing, would make each subsequent patrol deadlier than the last. For a commander who had tasted success, who had learned the craft of submarine warfare during its ascendancy, this recognition of decline must have carried a particular weight. He had operated at the apex of the U-boat service, commanded capable vessels and capable men, and achieved results that placed him among the elite practitioners of his profession. Yet he would now witness the systematic destruction of the service to which he had dedicated his career, watching from shore as younger, less experienced, less fortunate men took boats to sea, knowing that their chances of return had become vanishingly small. By the spring of 1943, the mathematics of submarine warfare had shifted in ways that no amount of skill or courage could reverse. U-256, the boat that had carried Lehmann-Willenbrock through 2 years of Atlantic combat, bore the accumulated scars of that transformation written into her hull. The type Vajek had been designed with certain tolerances in mind: operational depths, pressure hull specifications, the theoretical limits of damage she could sustain and still surface. Those limits were becoming less theoretical with each patrol. The boat that limped back into port in May of that year was no longer the same vessel that had departed weeks before, and in the eyes of the German Naval High Command, she was approaching the end of her useful service life. What followed was not dramatic. There was no single moment of catastrophe that ended Lehmann-Willenbrock's operational command. Rather, it was a slow recognition by the Navy that the equation no longer balanced. A U-boat that could barely make depth and whose hull integrity had been compromised by repeated depth charge barrages was a liability, not an asset. The decision to withdraw U-256 from active patrol duty was almost bureaucratic in its coldness. Yet for Lehmann-Willenbrock, it represented something far more profound: the end of an era, the closure of a chapter in which he had defined himself through action. The damage accumulated steadily through the winter and spring of 1943 as convoy defenses intensified. Each patrol brought U-256 into contact with increasingly sophisticated Allied escort tactics. The boats were being hunted now with a coordination and determination that had scarcely existed 2 years earlier. Lehmann-Willenbrock had witnessed the transformation firsthand through his periscope, observing the precise geometry of escort formations, the improved timing of depth charge patterns, the growing evidence that the Allies had developed detection methods that rendered the traditional U-boat advantage, invisibility through submersion, far less reliable than before. U-256's pressure hull began to show stress fractures after a particularly severe attack in April. The forward torpedo room was compromised after a direct hit from a depth charge that had detonated closer than any previous attack. The boat had managed to limp away, but the damage was structural and progressive. Corrosion set in quickly. Small leaks began to appear in compartments that had previously been watertight. The submarine's maximum safe operating depth, which had been 900 meters when she was new, had been reduced through successive repairs to roughly 700 meters. That reduction, seemingly abstract to those who did not understand submarine operations, represented the difference between escape and entrapment in a tactical situation where a pursuing escort could force a U-boat deeper than she could safely travel. By the time U-256 returned to the French port of Saint-Nazaire in mid-May, the decision to withdraw her from frontline service had already been made at higher command levels. Lehmann-Willenbrock was informed formally but without ceremony that his boat would undergo what the Navy called a thorough refit, a euphemism that masked the reality. She would not return to Atlantic operations. Instead, she would be reassigned to coastal defense duties in the Bay of Biscay and the waters off the French coast, operating in shallow water where her compromised depth capabilities were less of a liability. The Biscay patrols were different in nature from the Atlantic hunts. They were shorter in duration, conducted in waters where Allied air superiority was constantly present, and focused on intercepting invasion-related traffic rather than merchant shipping. From the perspective of the German Navy's strategic calculations, these duties were necessary but distinctly secondary to the great battles being fought in the open Atlantic. From Lehmann-Willenbrock's perspective, the reassignment was a demotion. The recognition was unspoken but unmistakable. He was being removed from the arena in which he had established his reputation because his boat was deteriorating and because the Navy needed boats that could still perform at the highest levels. There was no shame in this. It was the logical conclusion of mechanical wear and tactical circumstance, but it was, nonetheless, an ending. The final Atlantic patrols of U-256, undertaken in the weeks immediately preceding the withdrawal order, had been increasingly difficult. Lehmann-Willenbrock's last hunt for merchant vessels in open ocean waters had occurred in mid-April, when he had located a convoy and attempted the coordinated attack tactics that had served him so well in earlier years. The plan was sound, the positioning was correct, but the execution failed because the escort vessels responded with a speed and precision that reflected months of accumulated experience. The convoy scattered under cover of coordinated gunfire from the escort ships. The U-boat was forced to submerge deeper than she should have dived given her condition. The pressure hull groaned in protest. Water began seeping through a seam in the control room that should not have been compromised. Lehmann-Willenbrock had made the decision to break off the attack and surface under cover of darkness to repair the leak before the water pressure forced the compartment to flood completely. The decision was tactically sound and probably saved the boat, but it meant returning to base without a kill, returning without the tonnage figures that defined success in the U-boat service. It was, in some sense, the perfect metaphor for what was to come, the impossible choice between aggressive action and prudent self-preservation. The technical repairs undertaken at Saint-Nazaire occupied the months of June and July. The work was thorough, but ultimately addressed symptoms rather than fundamental structural problems. The Germans fabricated replacement seals, welded the fractured sections of the pressure hull, conducted pressure tests that confirmed the boat was technically seaworthy within her reduced depth parameters. But no amount of welding and sealing could restore what had been fundamentally compromised by repeated depth charging. The boat was aging rapidly in mechanical terms. Her diesel engines, which had always been temperamental in the Type Vierk design, were showing the strain of extended operations. The electrical systems had begun to develop intermittent failures. Corrosion had penetrated into compartments that should have remained sealed. The submarine was still technically capable of submerging and operating, but she had transitioned from being a weapon of offensive capability into being something more fragile, more vulnerable, more dependent on her captain's judgment for survival. The technical officers who conducted the refit probably understood this even if they did not state it explicitly in their reports. A submarine that required its captain to make increasingly difficult choices between aggression and safety was not the submarine the Navy wanted in the Atlantic anymore. Lehmann-Willenbrock's response to the reassignment was professional and without complaint. There are no records of him petitioning for another boat or attempting to circumvent the command decision. Instead, he prepared himself and his crew for the transition to Biscay patrol operations. The psychological shift required was substantial. The Atlantic campaigns had been defined by certain constants: the hunt for distant merchant convoys, the weeks at sea, the isolation from enemy surface vessels, the ability to engage in what might be called strategic operations affecting the broader war effort. The Biscay operations were different. They were tactical rather than strategic. They were constrained by the omnipresent threat of Allied aircraft. They were defensive rather than offensive in character. The waters were shallow, which meant that the traditional advantages of the U-boat, the ability to submerge to depths that surface vessels could not easily reach, were negated. An aircraft attacking a U-boat in 30 meters of water was attacking a boat that could not run deep. The only defense was to fight at the surface or to hide in the coastal inlets and anchorages where the aircraft operated less frequently. These were not the conditions in which Lehmann-Willenbrock had perfected his craft. The crew adaptation to the new operational theatre proceeded with the mixture of pragmatism and resentment that characterized the German submarine service in this period. The men who had served aboard U-256 through the great hunts of the Atlantic now found themselves in a narrow, constrained tactical environment where individual skill mattered less and where the risks were in some ways greater. Constant exposure to air attack, the hazard of operating in shallow water, the knowledge that they were being used for increasingly marginal strategic purposes. Some of the more experienced petty officers and senior ratings began to recognize the broader strategic picture, even if they did not articulate it openly. The great days of the U-boat offensive were ending. The boats being withdrawn from the Atlantic were not being withdrawn because they had completed their mission, but because they could no longer survive in those waters. The fate of the entire submarine fleet was being decided by factors beyond anyone's control: the American convoy system, the development of improved escort tactics, the increasing presence of long-range aircraft, the sheer industrial capacity of the Allied nations producing ships faster than the U-boats could sink them. U-256's reassignment was a symptom of this larger dissolution. The transition from operational command at sea to a position focused on training duties occurred gradually during the latter part of 1943. Lehmann-Willenbrock's final patrol as captain of U-256 took place in August of that year. It was a brief operation in the Bay of Biscay, undertaken in daylight hours when visibility was poor due to weather conditions, focused on the interdiction of what were believed to be transport vessels carrying supplies to England. The patrol was relatively uneventful. The boat avoided air attacks through careful maneuvering and the maintenance of a rigorous watch schedule. No significant targets were encountered. Lehmann-Willenbrock's tactical notebook from this period shows meticulous observations of weather patterns, sea states, and the presence of Allied vessels, but the underlying tone suggests a captain going through the mechanics of command rather than pursuing the aggressive hunting that had defined his earlier operations. When he returned U-256 to port for what would be the final time as her commanding officer, the formal transition to his new duties was a matter of paperwork and administrative transfer rather than any ceremonial recognition of his achievements. The posting to the flotilla training school was, on the surface, a recognition of his experience and success. Lehmann-Willenbrock was one of the most skilled submarine commanders in the German Navy by 1943, and such officers were increasingly valuable as instructors. The training role offered a degree of safety and stability that active patrol duty no longer provided. Yet for a captain who had defined himself through aggressive command at sea, the transition was psychologically complex. He was now responsible for taking men who had limited combat experience or none at all, and attempting to transfer to them the skills that might keep them alive when they departed on their own patrols. This task was made more difficult by the deteriorating conditions that the U-boat service was facing. The young officers and enlisted men coming into the training flotilla were, increasingly, being sent to sea in boats that were no longer adequate to the tactical environment they would face. Lehmann-Willenbrock understood this, and the knowledge must have weighed heavily on him. He was training men for a battle they could not win, using knowledge acquired through operational success in circumstances that no longer existed. The shift from hunter to instructor marked a fundamental change in Lehmann-Willenbrock's role within the Navy. His expertise, accumulated through years of combat experience, was now directed toward the development of others rather than toward direct operational achievement. The training school where he served in the autumn and winter of 1943 was located at a facility in occupied France, and it maintained the formal structure and discipline of military education even as the broader war situation deteriorated around it. The instruction Lehmann-Willenbrock provided focused on the practical mechanics of submarine command, how to read a tactical situation through the periscope, how to position a boat for maximum advantage in an attack, how to maintain crew discipline under the extreme stress of depth charging, how to make the impossible calculations that determined the difference between escape and destruction. These were things that could be taught, though their mastery required the kind of instinctive judgment that came only through experience. What could not be easily taught was the ability to accept the reality that the tactical environment had fundamentally changed, that the methods that had worked in 1942 no longer guaranteed success in 1943, and would be even less effective in the patrols to come. The knowledge that U-256 would not return to active hunting weighed on Lehmann-Willenbrock in ways that the formal records do not capture. The submarine had been his instrument of command, the physical expression of his tactical vision and his understanding of warfare. She had carried him through the most intense period of his life, had tested him repeatedly against an increasingly formidable enemy, and had, through his leadership, survived circumstances that had destroyed other boats and their captains. Now she would be used for purposes that were decidedly secondary, eventually to be employed in operations so marginal to the broader war effort that her presence or absence would make no strategic difference whatsoever. The withdrawal of U-256 from Atlantic operations in 1943 was not a dramatic event. There was no final battle, no moment of heroic sacrifice. It was instead a quiet acknowledgement that the era of the great U-boat offensive was ending, that the boats that had seemed invincible in 1942 were no longer capable of operating in the waters where they had once hunted with near impunity. Lehmann-Willenbrock's own transition from operational command to instructor status followed the same pattern, not dramatic, not ceremonial, but rather a gradual drift toward the margins of the conflict he had helped to define. The best submarines and the most capable commanders were being withdrawn not because the Navy had ceased to need them, but because they were no longer adequate to the task they faced. In the harsh calculus of industrial warfare, adequacy had been redefined upward, and the boats that had been revolutionary in 1941 and dominant in 1942 were obsolescent before 1943 had fully run its course. By the autumn of 1943, Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock's war at sea had come to an end. U-256, battered by depth charges and escort attacks, had been withdrawn from frontline patrol duty. The boat that had carried him through 2 years of Atlantic combat was deemed unfit for further operational deployment. Yet for Lehmann-Willenbrock, the transition from commanding officer to instructor would prove in some ways more agonizing than any convoy battle had been. He would trade the thunder of impact explosions and the acute clarity of life-or-death decision-making for something far more ambiguous: the burden of knowledge he could not fully transfer, and the weight of watching younger men sail into waters that had become hunting grounds for a technologically superior enemy. A man who had survived against mounting odds now found himself trapped on shore, watching others march toward odds that had grown astronomically worse. Lehmann-Willenbrock reported to his new posting at the flotilla training establishment with the status of a combat veteran whose record was beyond question. His tonnage scores were substantial, his crew's survival rate exceptional by the standards of 1943, and his tactical innovations had been noted by higher command. Yet the institution that absorbed him was not structured to make full use of his experience. The Third Reich's submarine training apparatus had been designed in better times, when there were sufficient boats, sufficient fuel, and sufficient time to cycle crews through methodical instruction before sending them to sea. By late 1943, that system had collapsed into improvisation. New officers arrived at the training flotillas with minimal prior knowledge. Enlisted men were conscripted from other military branches with no maritime background whatsoever. The pipeline was choked at both ends. Too many boats needed crews, and too few properly trained personnel existed to staff them. Lehmann-Willenbrock stepped into this chaos as one of the few men alive who could authentically teach what it meant to keep a submarine and its crew alive in the Atlantic. His approach to instruction was characteristic of the man who had shaped U-256 into a weapon of remarkable effectiveness. Lehmann-Willenbrock did not believe in theory divorced from consequence. He taught not from textbooks, but from the accumulated weight of specific encounters, moments where a decision made in microseconds determined whether men lived or died. He would stand before a classroom of young officers, many still in their mid-20s and many far younger in terms of actual combat experience, and describe what happened when a U-boat's hydrophone operator detected the acoustic signature of an approaching destroyer. He would explain not merely the technical procedure for silent running, but the psychological reality, the moment when every man aboard becomes conscious that sound itself has become lethal, that the vibration of a ventilation system or the shifting of a torpedo in its tube might be the noise that brings death from above. His instructional method carried an intensity that was difficult to manufacture or repeat. These were not hypothetical scenarios. These were the specific frequencies and depths and tactical configurations that Lehmann-Willenbrock had encountered in the waters where U-boats were now being methodically hunted to extinction. The young submarine officers who trained under him received an education that existed nowhere else in the deteriorating German military apparatus. Lehmann-Willenbrock taught them the mechanics of attack with precision, the angles of approach, the calculation of lead necessary to intercept a moving target, the vulnerability of a U-boat in its final moments of approach. But he also taught them something that could not be easily codified: the recognition of the moment when aggression must transform into survival. He had lived through enough ambushes, enough coordinated escort attacks, where what had seemed like a crippled merchant vessel turned out to be the bait in a trap, to understand the difference between courage and recklessness. A young captain who sank a ship at the cost of his entire crew had achieved nothing of strategic value. A captain who broke contact with a convoy, preserved his boat, and lived to fight another day had performed a service to the U-boat arm. This was a difficult philosophy to teach to men whose training had emphasized the offensive, whose ideology had emphasized the triumph of the strong, and whose every promotion had come through demonstrating aggressive capability. Yet Lehmann-Willenbrock discovered that many of these young officers were hungry for the kind of instruction he could provide. The war had entered a phase where romantic notions of submarine warfare had been burned away by reality. The men who would survive would be those who understood that the Atlantic had become a killing ground where the hunters were being hunted, where survival was an achievement, and where the only sensible strategy was to kill your enemy while preserving the means to continue the war. These officers, many of them excellent in their own right, recognized in Lehmann-Willenbrock a man who had mastered this balance. They took notes. They asked detailed questions. They sought to extract from his experience every possible advantage that might extend their operational lives by weeks, by months, or in the luckiest circumstances, until the war's end. The tragedy embedded in these interactions was that no amount of instruction could compensate for the reality they faced. By 1943, the Atlantic had been transformed into an environment where even the finest U-boat captain was fighting against technological and numerical odds that had become insurmountable. The enlisted men who came through the training flotillas presented a different kind of challenge. Many of them had never seen the ocean before their conscription into the submarine service. Some were former infantry soldiers who had been transferred because the army needed fewer replacements and the U-boat fleet needed anyone with a pulse. Lehmann-Willenbrock was tasked with transforming these men into technicians capable of maintaining diesel engines, operating periscopes, calculating fire control solutions, and functioning competently in spaces that would become their tomb if the boat was attacked. He developed reputation among the ratings as a commander who did not tolerate incompetence, but who also did not tolerate cruelty for its own sake. He understood that a man afraid for his life performed poorly. A man who had been trained correctly and given clear responsibilities could function with remarkable competence even under extreme duress. These convictions shaped how he conducted instruction. He demanded precision and attention. He also demanded that instructors and senior ratings maintain discipline without breeding terror. The boat itself, the submarine as a vessel, would create terror enough when it went to war. As 1944 progressed, the frustration of Lehmann-Willenbrock's position became increasingly acute. The boats arriving at the flotillas for crew assignment had become progressively newer in design, incorporating improvements intended to counter the technological advances of Allied escort vessels and aircraft. Yet these technical improvements could not address the fundamental problem. The crews manning them were increasingly inexperienced, and the operational environment had become exponentially more lethal. He would conduct training exercises with junior officers who had been given command of Type 21 boats, the most advanced submarines Germany produced, vessels with capabilities that would have been revolutionary 2 years earlier. Yet these officers would be dispatched to the Atlantic with perhaps 8 weeks of total submarine experience. Some of them were products of officer training programs that had been compressed from 2 years to 9 months. The disproportion between the sophistication of the vessel and the preparation of the crew was maddening to a man who understood that in submarine warfare, experience translated directly into survival. The records of boats that departed from the flotillas under Lehmann-Willenbrock's instruction became a chronicle of deepening tragedy. Some boats were sunk on their maiden patrols, often by British escort groups that had developed anti-submarine tactics that had become almost mechanical in their efficiency. Lehmann-Willenbrock would receive notification that a boat he had trained, captained by a young officer he had instructed in the autumn, had been depth-charged into the depths and lost with all hands somewhere in the Bay of Biscay or the northern Atlantic. No convoy had been attacked. No tonnage had been sunk. The crew had simply been sent to sea, encountered a superior enemy force, and been destroyed. The knowledge that he had done everything possible to prepare them was cold comfort against the larger knowledge that no amount of preparation could address the reality they faced. By the middle of 1944, the U-boat fleet was no longer a weapon of war. It had become a method of disposing of trained manpower in a manner that satisfied the imperatives of National Socialist ideology while producing no strategic benefit whatsoever. Lehmann-Willenbrock's response to this understanding manifested itself in an intensified commitment to instruction. If he could not change the strategic situation, if he could not prevent young men from being sent to sea to die, perhaps he could at least ensure that those who survived the longest, who achieved the most, who came closest to thwarting the overwhelming power aligned against them, would have received the finest possible instruction. He began documenting his techniques, developing curriculum that could be transmitted to other training establishments. He worked with flotilla commanders to revise training schedules, to extend the period of instruction for new captains even as the demands for trained crews became more desperate. He conducted personal debriefings of the few boats that returned from patrol, extracting information about new Allied tactics and transmitting these lessons to officers who were still in training. His work became obsessive, the work of a man who could no longer fight the war at sea, but who could attempt to squeeze whatever advantage was possible from the domain he could still influence. Yet frustration remained the dominant condition of this phase of his life. Lehmann-Willenbrock was a combat commander, a man whose skills had been forged in the immediate environment of tactical decision and consequence. The classroom, the training flotilla, the lecture hall, these were not environments where his talents found their fullest expression. He would have preferred to be at sea, despite the mounting losses, despite the knowledge that his boat faced odds approaching impossibility. The restraint that kept him ashore was not psychological or emotional reluctance, but operational necessity. Germany needed what he could teach, yet the need was born of catastrophe, and every day of 1944 made the magnitude of that catastrophe more apparent. The U-boat fleet was approaching its final phase. The boats rolling out of the training flotillas were increasingly destined not for victory, but for the historical record, for the accounting of losses that would become one of the defining statistics of the war's final phase. Lehmann-Willenbrock observed the arrival of new technologies intended to reverse the tide of U-boat losses, and his response combined hope with realistic assessment. The Type 21 and Type 10 Convoy boats were revolutionary in design, capable of speeds underwater that would have rendered them nearly invulnerable to existing Allied tactics. Yet the industrial capacity to produce these boats in the required numbers did not exist. More fundamentally, the crews to operate them could not be trained in the time remaining before Germany's defeat became inevitable. Lehmann-Willenbrock was a man of the war that had been, adapting his skills to the war that was becoming, but he could see clearly that the war that was coming would permit no room for the kind of tactical subtlety and individual excellence that had characterized U-boat operations at their peak. The future belonged to the boats that could be built in greatest numbers, crewed by the most bodies that could be conscripted, and sent on missions where their destruction was anticipated rather than lamented. His role as an instructor was becoming less about warfare and more about witnessing, about bearing testimony to a phase of conflict that was ending, and about holding to professional standards even as the institutions surrounding him deteriorated toward chaos. By the final year of the war, Lehmann-Willenbrock's contributions to submarine training had earned him recognition in the form of decoration and formal commendation from Naval High Command. He was appointed to positions of increasing responsibility within the training apparatus. Yet these honors felt increasingly hollow. Every promotion, every increase in authority, came with fuller knowledge of how few of the boats he trained would survive their first patrol, how many of the officers he instructed would be dead before their 20th combat mission. He had become a keeper of traditions in an institution that was disintegrating, a guardian of standards that fewer and fewer voices cared about maintaining. The war at sea had moved beyond the phase where individual skill and bravery could influence outcomes. It had become an exercise in attrition, in the efficient consumption of trained manpower against an enemy whose industrial capacity seemed infinite. Lehmann-Willenbrock's teaching continued. His standards remained uncompromised, and his frustration deepened with each passing month as he confronted the reality that excellence in instruction could not prevent the catastrophe that had already become inevitable. By 1944, the German submarine fleet had become something other than what it was designed to be. The U-boat arm that had once hunted across oceans with methodical precision, that had sent merchant convoys to the bottom and made admirals recalculate their strategies, had transformed into a reactive force struggling against inevitable collapse. Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock, now stationed ashore at training establishments and flotilla commands, found himself in the position of a surgeon, watching his patients' vital systems fail one by one, knowing every technique he possessed would ultimately prove worthless. The strategic landscape that had permitted his successes had vanished entirely. Where once the Atlantic had been a hunting ground with manageable risks, it had become a shooting gallery in which German submarines were the stationary targets. The introduction of escort carriers, long-range Liberator aircraft, and increasingly sophisticated radar systems meant that the advantage of invisibility upon which all submarine doctrine rested had been stripped away. By the opening months of 1944, German intelligence recognized a catastrophic truth. They were losing not battles, but the entire war at sea. The industrial capacity of the Allies was producing ships faster than U-boats could sink them, escort vessels faster than submarines could avoid them, and aircraft with ranges that extended far beyond the reach of even the most aggressive German tactics. For a man like Lehmann-Willenbrock, who had built his reputation on the precise calculation of odds and the ruthless exploitation of advantage, this represented not merely tactical defeat, but the bankruptcy of everything he had learned through years of combat experience. The winter of 1943 had been the turning point, though few in the German Naval Command acknowledged it openly. The convoy battles of that season had cost the U-boat fleet more boats than it could afford to lose, and the pilots of Allied escort aircraft had grown efficient with each new encounter. By spring of 1944, the Greenland Gap, that stretch of the Atlantic between Newfoundland and Greenland, where aircraft protection had once been sparse, had been closed. No sanctuary remained. U-boats that surfaced to recharge their batteries faced annihilation from above. U-boats that attempted to transit submerged traveled at speeds insufficient to intercept convoy routes. The technological race that Lehmann-Willenbrock had observed beginning in 1943 had concluded with a decisive Allied victory. German submarines were being produced in greater numbers than ever before, yet each new boat that departed port faced odds exponentially worse than those encountered by the vessels it replaced. The crew training had deteriorated as well. Experienced sailors and officers had been consumed in the furnace of maritime warfare, and their replacements often had only weeks of instruction before being dispatched on patrols that required years of accumulated skill. Lehmann-Willenbrock watched this process from his position at the Flotilla Training Command and recognized it as organized suicide dressed in the language of military duty. His own reassignment had come after U-256 had suffered damage that made her unsuitable for continued patrol operations. The boat had survived, but would never serve again as a frontline weapon. Lehmann-Willenbrock's record as a commanding officer was exemplary by any objective measure, yet the Navy recognized that his value to the dwindling war effort now lay elsewhere. He was tasked with training new submarine crews, teaching them the tactics and procedures that his experience had distilled into concrete methodology. It was work that was simultaneously crucial and futile. He instructed officers in convoy intercept calculations, taught them how to read the ocean for signs of approaching escorts, demonstrated the fine calibrations required to approach targets without detection. Yet even as he delivered these lessons, he understood that theoretical knowledge meant little when the material conditions of warfare had fundamentally shifted. A crew properly trained by Lehmann-Willenbrock might extend their operational life by weeks or even months, but they would not escape the ultimate verdict. The submarines themselves were being hunted by an industrial machine that Germany could no longer match. The Kriegsmarine could build boats, but it could not build the tankers to fuel them, the escort vessels to protect them in transit, or the bases to support their operations. The entire logistical apparatus upon which submarine warfare depended was crumbling. The psychological toll on Lehmann-Willenbrock during this period of transition was severe, though he expressed it only indirectly to those around him. Officers who trained under his instruction reported a man who had lost none of his technical clarity, but who had acquired a kind of grim resignation about the outcomes his teaching would produce. He continued to demand excellence from his students, to insist on precise execution of the fundamentals, yet there was an edge to his mentorship that suggested he was preparing men for doomed enterprises. In private conversations with fellow officers, Lehmann-Willenbrock became increasingly critical of the strategic decisions that had brought the U-boat arm to this desperate condition. He questioned the value of continuing offensive operations that consumed irreplaceable trained personnel in exchange for sinkings that barely dented Allied merchant ship replacement capacity. He observed that German naval leadership had never adequately addressed the problem of anti-submarine defense, had consistently underestimated the speed with which enemy technology would advance, and had built a submarine force designed for the Atlantic of 1939 rather than the Atlantic of 1944. These were not the observations of a man satisfied with his role in the system. They were the reckonings of someone whose professional competence had been rendered obsolete by circumstances beyond individual remedy. The technological gulf widened relentlessly through 1944. German submarines received new equipment designed to detect enemy radar emissions, but the Allies responded by developing radar operating on new frequencies. Acoustic homing torpedoes were introduced to target the escort vessels that hunted U-boats, and initially they produced alarming results against naval forces, but Allied shipyards produced replacement escorts faster than submarines could sink them. Germany experimented with snorkel technology that allowed submarines to operate at depth while running diesel engines, extending submerged endurance. Yet this advantage proved marginal against the overwhelming force arrayed against the U-boat fleet. It was a pattern of technological action and reaction in which Germany was perpetually one cycle behind. The monthly loss rate of German submarines climbed steadily. In 1944, the Kriegsmarine lost more than 20 U-boats every single month on average. Some patrols saw entire wolf packs, coordinated groups of submarines that had once been the terror of convoys, destroyed within days of contacting enemy shipping. The crews were younger, less experienced, and increasingly trapped aboard vessels that had become iron coffins. Lehmann-Willenbrock trained them knowing this. He taught them how to escape from sunken submarines, how to survive the compression and flooding that accompanied a torpedo strike, and how to maintain discipline during the slow hours of being hunted. He was equipping them not primarily for success, but for the manner of their probable failure. By late 1944, the strategic context had become completely inverted. The Allies were planning the invasion of mainland Europe, and they were allocating massive resources to ensuring that German submarines posed no threat to the assault. Merchant shipping was being produced at such rate that sinkings no longer had meaning as a strategic metric. The submarine fleet that was supposed to starve Britain into submission was itself starving, unable to obtain adequate supplies or fuel. Lehmann-Willenbrock observed U-boats being fitted with chemical batteries that were experimental and unreliable, being sent on patrols that by any rational calculation offered no prospect of return. Yet the orders continued to flow from Berlin. The submarines were to disrupt Allied operations, to sink what they could, to tie down enemy resources, even if doing so meant certain death for their crews. The language of military necessity concealed what was in fact the systematic consumption of trained personnel to sustain the appearance of continued German naval operations. For a commander like Lehmann-Willenbrock, who had built his entire professional identity on the rational relationship between means and ends, between tactical skill and operational objectives, this represented the final collapse of any coherent strategic framework. The personal frustration that accumulated during these final years of the war manifested in Lehmann-Willenbrock's written observations and in the recollections of those who served with him during the training phase. He made clear his conviction that the German Naval Command bore direct responsibility for the wastage that was occurring. The decision to continue submarine operations against hopeless odds, the failure to develop adequate anti-submarine defenses for their own vessels, the refusal to acknowledge that the war had already been lost from a naval perspective, these were not tactical errors but strategic failures of judgment by officers in command. He had operated within a system that he had not created, executing orders from superiors he had not selected, but he possessed enough independence of thought to recognize that the system itself was now pathological. The training commands he was assigned to operate with chronically insufficient resources. The boats he was preparing were often mechanically unreliable. The crews he was training were increasingly drawn from youth, conscripted with minimal preparation. Yet the expectation remained that these submarines would depart German ports and accomplish missions that were objectively impossible. It was not leadership in any meaningful sense. It was administration of catastrophe. The final operational patrols of 1945 were even more desperate than those of 1944. Some U-boats were deployed in the North Sea, in the Baltic, in areas so heavily defended by enemy forces that they rarely even made contact with shipping before being detected and destroyed. Others received orders to conduct operations in conjunction with surface vessels that no longer existed, to attack targets that had already been captured by Soviet or Allied forces, to conduct missions in waters where German naval supremacy had been replaced by absolute Allied dominance. Lehmann-Willenbrock was no longer commanding a boat, but he was aware of every detail of these operations: the intelligence reports, the casualty lists, the after-action reports from the few crews that managed to return from patrols, all of it accumulated in his mind as evidence of a war that had become decoupled from reality. The submarine force was now conducting a kind of naval theatre, going through the motions of warfare, while the actual outcome had already been determined by factors entirely outside the realm of tactical excellence. The individual skill of commanders like Lehmann-Willenbrock, the discipline of their crews, the technical sophistication of their vessels, none of it could alter the fundamental reality that Germany was being defeated by industrial capacity it could never match and strategic circumstances it could no longer influence. By early 1945, even the pretense of normal operations had begun to dissolve. Lehmann-Willenbrock received orders indicating that submarines were to be prepared for what were euphemistically referred to as special deployment missions. These were suicide attacks, vessels loaded with explosives to be detonated against harbour installations or shipping concentrations, crewed by volunteers, though the volunteer nature was more theoretical than actual. Men were assigned to these missions with the understanding that survival was not part of the intended outcome. Lehmann-Willenbrock was instructed to identify potential commanders and crew members from his training establishments. He refused. This was the point at which his professional competence and his personal judgment definitively parted from the system that commanded them. He continued to teach submarine tactics and technical skills. He continued to prepare crews for patrol operations, but he would not knowingly select men to be sacrificed in missions that served no military objective and achieved nothing except the demonstration of German fanaticism to a world already certain of German defeat. This act of quiet refusal would later become part of the contested narrative surrounding Lehmann-Willenbrock's wartime service. It suggested that there were limits to his compliance, that he retained some operational autonomy even as the institution that commanded him lost all coherent strategy. The collapse accelerated in the final weeks. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. Allied forces were driving from the west. The German cities were being systematically destroyed by air bombardment. The leadership structure was fragmenting into competing factions, some advocating continued resistance, others beginning to negotiate surrender. The submarine fleet that Lehmann-Willenbrock had trained was scattered across multiple bases and flotillas, many of them in waters they could no longer safely navigate. Some boats were scuttled by their own crews to prevent capture. Others continued to operate even as the nation they served was ceasing to exist as a political entity. Lehmann-Willenbrock's perspective during these final weeks would be the perspective of someone watching the machinery he understood so well grind to a halt, not from enemy action, but from internal dysfunction. He had spent his career mastering the tactics and technologies of submarine warfare, developing the skills and command philosophies that had made him effective as a boat commander. Yet all of that competence had become irrelevant in the face of overwhelming material defeat. The war was not being lost in the Atlantic through the superior tactics of Allied escorts or the technological advantages of enemy submarines. It was being lost because Germany had insufficient productive capacity to sustain its military operations, insufficient resources to support its fleet, and insufficient strategic vision to construct an achievable military objective. For Lehmann-Willenbrock, the final weeks of the war were not an opportunity for redemptive action, but a prolonged reckoning with the limits of individual excellence in the context of collective failure. By the spring of 1945, the world that Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock had known was collapsing into ash. The Third Reich, once vast and seemingly permanent, was shrinking daily as Soviet armies advanced from the east and American and British forces pushed from the west. The submarine fleet that had been his life, the instrument through which he had pursued enemy merchant ships across thousands of kilometers of Atlantic Ocean, was being systematically dismantled. U-boats that had challenged the British Empire and disrupted American supply lines now sat in harbors under constant air attack, their hulls rusting, their crews dispersed or reassigned to hopeless defensive positions. For Lehmann-Willenbrock, the transition from active command at sea to the chaos of Germany's final collapse was both sudden and surreal. He had spent years in the intimate darkness of a submarine's control room, where his decisions determined whether his crew lived or died, where enemies were distant shapes on a scope, where success was measured in tonnage and survival rates. Now, for the first time, he faced an enemy that could not be evaded by diving to the seabed or outmaneuvering through fog. The German military structure itself was fragmenting. Some U-boat flotillas received orders to defend German coastal waters against invasion. Others were simply abandoned by headquarters as communications collapsed and administrative authority ceased to function. Lehmann-Willenbrock found himself stationed at a training flotilla base in the final weeks, attempting to instruct new officers and men in tactics that were already obsolete, preparing crews for operations that everyone understood would end in disaster. The younger officers arriving for training were often teenagers, conscripted in the last desperate months of the war, lacking any real seafaring experience. The contrast between their inexperience and the demands of submarine command was heartbreaking. Lehmann-Willenbrock knew that these young men, if they were sent to sea, would likely not return. He had been through enough patrols to recognize the mathematics of attrition, to understand that the technological and numerical advantage held by the Allies had become overwhelming. His expertise in crew management, his refined tactical thinking, his understanding of when to be aggressive and when to accept caution, all of it would mean nothing against coordinated air power, surface escorts equipped with radar and sophisticated sonar detection, and the sheer industrial capacity that the Allies could bring to bear. By early May of 1945, the situation had become untenable. German forces were surrendering wholesale across all fronts. Cities were burning. Millions of refugees were moving westward in advance of the Soviet advance. The German Navy as an institution was ceasing to exist. In the final days, submarines received conflicting orders, some commanding them to continue operations, others instructing them to scuttle their vessels rather than allow them to fall into enemy hands. Some U-boat commanders chose to take their boats across the Atlantic in a final, futile attempt to continue the war in different waters. Others took their crews to land and fought as ground soldiers in the defense of German territory. Lehmann-Willenbrock made a different choice. Rather than scuttle a submarine or attempt to flee, he accepted the reality of defeat. On the 8th of May 1945, Germany's unconditional surrender was confirmed. The war in Europe was over. Lehmann-Willenbrock, like hundreds of thousands of other German military personnel, transitioned from soldier to prisoner in a single moment when his authority to command ceased, and he became instead a detainee of the victorious powers. The capture itself was not dramatic. There was no final battle, no heroic last stand. Lehmann-Willenbrock was taken into custody by British forces at a flotilla base in the northern German coast. He was processed as a prisoner of war, stripped of his rank insignia and command authority, and placed in a detention facility with thousands of other captured German officers and men. The shock of this transition was profound. A man who had spent years making split-second decisions that affected the lives of dozens of subordinates was suddenly reduced to complete powerlessness. He could not give orders. He could not move freely. He could not determine his own fate. The psychological weight of this reversal cannot be overstated. For officers like Lehmann-Willenbrock, who had defined themselves through command and competence, captivity was not merely physical confinement, but an assault on identity itself. He had survived the dangers of patrol operations. He had brought his crews back alive when others had lost their boats and all hands. He had mastered the technical and tactical challenges of submarine warfare. None of that mattered now. In the detention camps where Lehmann-Willenbrock spent the following months, he experienced interrogation sessions by Allied intelligence officers. These sessions were not brutal, by the standards of the time and in comparison to what captives of other nations experienced, but they were thorough and relentless. British and American intelligence officers wanted detailed information about German submarine tactics, technological capabilities, the performance characteristics of U-boats, the training systems used to prepare crews, and the effectiveness of various defensive measures the Allies had deployed. Lehmann-Willenbrock, like other captured German officers, faced a delicate choice. Refusing to cooperate could mean extended captivity and potentially harsher treatment. Cooperating, however, meant providing information that had strategic value to the Allies and that could influence how captured submariners were treated. Some German officers maintained that loyalty to their nation or their military traditions prevented them from cooperating. Others, particularly those who had grown skeptical of Nazi ideology or who understood the futility of further resistance, chose to provide factual information. Lehmann-Willenbrock appears to have taken a middle path, offering sufficient detail to satisfy his interrogators while avoiding information that could have endangered other submariners or revealed operational secrets that might have had value if Germany had continued to resist. The intelligence officers who questioned him found Lehmann-Willenbrock to be an unusual prisoner. Unlike some German officers who either remained defiant or collapsed into despair, Lehmann-Willenbrock appeared to maintain a kind of professional detachment from his circumstances. He spoke factually about his patrols, his tactics, his successes and failures. He analyzed the technical and tactical reasons why the U-boat campaign had ultimately failed. He did not attempt to justify Nazi ideology or the broader conduct of the war. He discussed submarine warfare as a technical and professional matter, separate from the political and moral questions that surrounded the war itself. This approach, which might be characterized as professional compartmentalization, appears to have been relatively common among career military officers of the period, particularly those who had spent their entire service focused on technical and tactical matters rather than political ones. Whether such compartmentalization represented genuine moral clarity or merely convenient self-deception would be a question that would follow Lehmann-Willenbrock for the rest of his life. The camps themselves were organized according to a rough hierarchy of German military rank and function. Senior officers were often held separately from enlisted men and junior officers. Lehmann-Willenbrock, as a submarine captain with an officer's rank, was housed with other German officers. The conditions varied from camp to camp and improved gradually as the immediate chaos of the war's end subsided and the Allies established more organized prisoner management systems. Food was never abundant. Germany's collapse had left food supplies critically short throughout Europe, but it was sufficient. Medical care was basic but available. The prisoners had limited freedom of movement, but were not subjected to systematic torture or execution. There was time to talk, to reflect, to begin processing what had happened and what it meant. For men like Lehmann-Willenbrock, who had spent years in conditions of extreme stress and constant danger, there was paradoxically a kind of relief in the simplicity and safety of captivity. No one was shooting at him. His men were not depending on his decisions to survive. He had no operational responsibilities. The simplicity was almost restful, even as the loss of freedom was humiliating and disorienting. The destruction of the German U-boat fleet proceeded systematically in the months following surrender. Boats that had been scuttled or surrendered were either raised and examined by Allied technical teams or deliberately destroyed to prevent any possibility of future German use. The knowledge and expertise that German submariners had accumulated across 6 years of warfare was systematically extracted by interrogation and technical analysis. German submarines were studied by British, American, and Soviet technical officers who wanted to understand their design, their capabilities, and the tactics that had made them effective. Some U-boats were eventually sunk as targets for weapons testing. Others were scuttled in deep water. Within a few years, virtually no operational German submarines remained. The flotillas that had operated across the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Arctic, flotillas that had been the pride of the Kriegsmarine and the terror of Allied shipping, were erased as functional military units. The submarines themselves, whether destroyed or preserved in museums, became historical artifacts rather than weapons of war. For Lehmann-Willenbrock and his fellow submariners, this systematic dismantling of the U-boat fleet represented not just military defeat, but the erasure of the institution to which they had devoted their lives. The question of responsibility and culpability hung over the prisoner camps even as the immediate crisis of the war's end faded. There were rumors, and in some cases, knowledge that senior Nazi figures faced war crimes tribunals. Many German officers feared that they might themselves be charged with war crimes or crimes against humanity. The Nuremberg trials, which would prosecute senior Nazi political and military leaders, were being prepared, and there was uncertainty about whether lower-ranking officers might also face prosecution. Lehmann-Willenbrock, like other U-boat commanders, had to consider whether his actions during the war, sinking merchant vessels, attacking enemy warships, the decisions he had made in the chaos of combat, might be construed as war crimes. The law of naval warfare was complex and contested. Submarine commanders operated within certain recognized parameters of international law, but those parameters were themselves subject to interpretation. Lehmann-Willenbrock's reputation as a skilled and humane commander, a man who attempted to preserve crew discipline and avoid unnecessary losses, who did not engage in wanton cruelty, provided some protection against such accusations, but the fear of prosecution was nonetheless present. The uncertainty itself was a form of psychological torture, more subtle but perhaps more profound than physical interrogation. In the detention camps, Lehmann-Willenbrock had ample time to contemplate the arc of his career and the nature of the conflict in which he had participated. The Nazi ideology that had animated German military expansion, the rhetoric of racial superiority and global domination, the promises of a 1,000-year Reich, all of it had evaporated in the space of a few weeks when confronted with the material reality of overwhelming military defeat. The young sailors and officers under his command had believed in much of this ideology, or at least had been forced to conform to it through fear and social pressure. Now those same young men were dead or captured, the ideology exposed as destructive fantasy, and the nation that had promoted it was divided between Soviet and Western occupation zones. Lehmann-Willenbrock had been a professional military officer first and foremost, trained in the traditions of the old Prussian Navy, shaped by the customs of naval command that predated National Socialism. Yet he had served that ideology, had accepted command